My late wife Evelyns' vintage gold medallion was the only piece of her I had left to hold on to. When I opened the safe and found the velvet box completely empty, my daughter Brittany simply sighed over the phone. "Dad." It was just old metal. Trevor and I desperately needed a vacation to Cabo, so I sold it. When I tracked down the buyer to get it back, the pawnshop owner walked out of his back room looking like he had seen a ghost. "Mr. Keller, you will not believe what I found when I cleaned the pendant. I did not even know the medallion opened." Before I tell you what was inside, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you believe betrayal from your own blood is the deepest wound of all. I am George Keller, a 70-year-old retired architect living in a quiet suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. Since Evelyn passed away, my house has been a museum of silence. Evelyn was a meticulous woman. Everything had its place. Her books, her gardening tools, and most importantly, her jewelry. The vintage gold medallion was her signature piece. She wore it on our wedding day and on our 40th anniversary. Before her sudden fatal stroke, she took it off and asked me to lock it in the heavy steel safe hidden in my study. The combination was a closely guarded secret known only to me and as a precaution to our only child, Brittany. I gave Brittany the numbers thinking I was being a responsible father, preparing for emergencies. I never imagined the emergency would be her own greed. It started on a Tuesday morning. I wanted to hold the necklace. I missed the weight of it in my hands. The heavy brass dial of the safe clicked into place and the heavy door swung open. I reached for the familiar burgundy velvet box sitting on the middle shelf. But the moment my fingers brushed the fabric, my stomach plummeted. It was too light. I flipped the lid open. The cream-colored satin interior was perfectly intact, but the heavy gold chain and the intricate circular medallion were gone. Just an empty indentation remained. A cold sweat broke out across my neck. We had no signs of a break-in. The house alarms were perfectly silent. The windows were locked. Only one other person on this earth possessed the combination to that safe. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed Brittany's number. My heart hammered against ribs with a heavy, erratic rhythm. The phone rang 3 times before she finally picked up. I could immediately hear the chaotic background noise, the muffled voice of an intercom speaker announcing boarding zones, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of a busy terminal. "Hello, Dad." "What is it?" she answered. Her voice carried that familiar tone of impatient annoyance she always used with me lately, as if my very existence was an inconvenience interrupting her busy schedule. "Brittany," I asked, my voice trembling slightly, "have you been in my safe? Where is your mother's necklace?" There was a brief pause on the line. Not a pause of guilt, but a pause of someone trying to calculate the fastest way to dismiss a nuisance. "Dad." "Please do not be so dramatic," she sighed loudly. "It is just old metal. It was just sitting in the dark, gathering dust. Trevor has been so stressed at his corporate job lately, and we desperately needed a break. We are at the airport lounge right now, heading to Cabo for 2 weeks." I stood frozen in my study, gripping the edge of the heavy wooden desk to keep my balance. You sold your mother's necklace," I whispered, barely able to force the words past the lump in my throat. "You stole from my home to pay for a vacation." "Oh, please, Dad, do not use the word steal," she snapped, the annoyance in her voice escalating into defensive anger. "I am your only daughter. I am the sole heir anyway. It is technically going to be mine eventually. You sit in that house all day, holding on to ghosts. Trevor and I are actually living our lives. We needed the cash. You should be happy for us getting away." I listened to her justify the betrayal with breathtaking entitlement. For years, I had watched her and Trevor live far beyond their means. The leased luxury cars, the constant expensive dinners, the designer clothes. Trevor was a mid-level corporate manager who acted like a billionaire, and Brittany was always eager to play the part of the wealthy socialite. I had bailed them out of minor credit card debts before, but this was a boundary I never thought she would cross. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice or curse at her. A profound, icy calm washed over me, freezing the fatherly affection I had held onto for so long. I went completely cold. "Give me the name of the buyer," I demanded. My voice was dangerously flat, devoid of any emotion. "Dad, let it go," she groaned. "The name of the buyer." "Brittany." I repeated, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Or I call the airport police right now and report a stolen high-value item in your possession before you board that flight." "Fine," she spat out. "It is some dusty place downtown. Leo's Gold and Pawn. There, you happy now? Do not call me for the next 2 weeks. I am turning my phone off." The line went dead. I lowered the phone, staring at the empty velvet box on my desk. The daughter I raised had just shown me exactly who she was. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door. The drive to downtown Charlotte felt like a blur. The gray afternoon sky matched the heavy storm brewing inside my chest. I navigated the busy city streets with a singular laser-focused objective. I had to get Evelyns' necklace back before it was melted down or sold to a stranger. I parked my old sedan a block away from the pawn shop and walked briskly down the sidewalk. Leo's Gold and Pawn was a narrow storefront squeezed between a coffee shop and an old bookstore. The bell above the door chimed loudly as I pushed my way inside. The shop smelled of brass, old dust, and floor wax. Glass display cases lined the walls, filled with watches, rings, and electronics. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 50s wearing a magnifying loupe around his neck and a faded denim apron. He looked up as I approached. "Welcome, can I help you find something?" he asked, wiping his hands on a cloth. "I need to buy back a piece of jewelry that was brought in here yesterday," I said, my voice tight with anxiety. A heavy vintage gold medallion on a thick chain. It was brought in by a blonde woman in her 30s. "That necklace belonged to my late wife. I will pay whatever you gave her for it, plus a premium." Leo frowned, pulling his ledger from under the counter. He traced his finger down the list of recent transactions. A blonde woman in her 30s. Vintage gold medallion. Yes, I remember her. She came in yesterday afternoon looking for quick cash. Seemed in a terrible hurry. I gave her a fair market price for the gold weight. "Do you still have it?" I asked, bracing myself for the worst. "Please tell me it has not been sold." Leo nodded sympathetically. "You are in luck, sir. It is a beautiful piece. I have not put it out in the display cases yet. It is in the back room right now. I was just in the middle of giving it a deep polish and cleaning before pricing it for resale. Let me go grab it for you." He disappeared through a heavy velvet curtain behind the counter. I stood there staring at the ticking grandfather clock on the wall, counting the seconds. The relief washing over me was immense, but it was heavily tainted by the bitter reality of Brittany's actions. I took out my wallet, ready to pay whatever extortionate price was required to retrieve the only tangible memory of my beloved Evelyn. Minutes passed. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder in the quiet shop. I shifted my weight impatiently, wondering what was taking so long. Finally, the velvet curtain parted, and Leo walked back into the main shop. But his demeanor had completely changed. I was no longer the calm, businesslike pawnbroker. All the color had drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and deeply unsettled. In his left hand, he held Evelyn's gold chain. The heavy circular medallion was dangling from it, but it looked different. In his right hand, he held a tiny pair of precision jeweler's tweezers. "Mr. Keller," he said, his voice dropping to a hushed, almost conspiratorial whisper. "You said this necklace belonged to your late wife." "Yes," I replied, stepping closer to the glass counter, my brow furrowed in confusion. "Is there a problem? Is the gold damaged?" He shook his head slowly, laying a black velvet mat on the glass counter. He gently placed the necklace onto the mat. "No, the gold is perfectly fine. But sir, you will not believe what I found when I started cleaning the pendant." I looked down at the medallion. For the 40 years Evelyn had worn it, it had always been a solid, heavy piece of cast gold. But now, looking closely at it under the bright display lights, I realized I was wrong. The medallion was not solid. It was a locket. The front face of the circular pendant had popped open, revealing a hollowed-out cavity inside. "I did not even know the medallion opened," I whispered, leaning over the counter in shock. "Evelyn never told me." Leo nodded, pushing his magnifying loupe up onto his forehead. "I did not know either. I was applying pressure with my polishing cloth along the rim, trying to get some tarnish out of the grooves. I must have hit a hidden spring mechanism. The front cover just clicked and popped wide open. But that is not the shocking part, sir. It is what was hidden inside." Leo used his tiny tweezers to carefully extract two objects from the hollow cavity of the medallion, setting them down on the black velvet mat. The first object was a tiny black square of plastic, a micro SD memory card, the kind you would use in a digital camera or a smartphone. The second object was a very small square of paper folded over and over upon itself, until it was small enough to fit perfectly behind the memory card. My breath caught in my throat. My hands began to tremble as I reached out and gently picked up the folded piece of paper. The paper felt fragile, thin, and deeply personal. I slowly unfolded the tiny square, flattening out the creases. I immediately recognized the handwriting. It was the elegant, precise cursive script that I had read on grocery lists, birthday cards, and love letters for 4 decades. It was Evelyn's handwriting. I pulled my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and put them on, squinting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the pawn shop. At the top corner of the tiny paper was a date. I recognized the date instantly. It was exactly 3 days before Evelyn suffered the massive, sudden stroke that took her from me. Below the date was a single, hurried sentence written in dark blue ink. "George, check the equity. They think I do not know." I stared at the words, my vision blurring, as the world around me seemed to tilt on its axis. "George, check the equity. They think I do not know." I looked down at the tiny black micro SD card resting on the velvet mat. The implications of that message hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Check the equity. She was talking about the house. The house we had spent 30 years paying off. The house that was completely ours, free and clear of any mortgages or debts. But who were they? Brittany and Trevor. It had to be. Evelyn had always been the one to manage our finances. She reviewed every bank statement, balanced every checkbook, and filed every tax return with absolute precision. She had found something terrible, something so dangerous that she felt the need to hide the evidence inside a hidden compartment of the necklace she never took off her body. She was gathering proof, but her sudden passing had silenced her before she could bring it to me. "Mr. Keller," Leo asked softly, breaking the heavy silence in the shop. "Are you all right, sir? Should I get you a glass of water?" I slowly folded the tiny piece of paper and carefully placed it in my breast pocket alongside the micro SD card. I looked up at Leo, my grief suddenly hardening into a cold, calculated resolve. I was no longer just a grieving widower trying to retrieve a stolen, sentimental keepsake. I was a man who had just received a final, desperate warning from beyond the grave. "I am fine, Leo," I said, my voice steady and dark. "How much do I owe you for the necklace?" Leo named the amount he had paid. Brittany and I immediately placed enough cash on the counter to cover his purchase price, his cleaning work, and a substantial holding deposit. But I did not take the necklace with me. The safe in my safe had already been compromised, and Brittany still possessed both a key to my house and the combination. Carrying the medallion home would place Evelyn's last piece of evidence directly within her reach. I asked Leo to seal the gold chain and the open locket inside a numbered evidence pouch, record the date and time, and store the package in his master time delay vault. He agreed without hesitation. I took only the micro SD card and Evelyn's folded note, signing a receipt confirming that the physical necklace would remain in his custody until I returned. When I stepped outside, my fist was empty, but the weight of what Evelyn had hidden seemed to press against my entire chest. Brittany believed she had sold an old piece of metal. In reality, she had delivered her mother's final warning into the hands of the one person she had intended to protect. I got back into my sedan and stared at the steering wheel. I needed to see exactly what Evelyn had preserved on that memory card. I needed to know exactly what Trevor and Brittany had done. And more importantly, I needed to prepare for war. The time for being the accommodating, loving father was over. They had mistaken my quiet grief for weakness. But they were about to learn that Evelyn and I had built our lives on a foundation they could never crack. I started the engine, the roar of the motor matching the newfound fire burning in my chest. I was going home to uncover the truth, and they were going to pay for every single lie. I pulled into the driveway of the home Evelyn and I had built together. The dark clouds that had been gathering all afternoon finally broke, unleashing a heavy downpour against the windshield. I sat in the car for a moment, letting the rhythmic drumming of the rain wash over me. The house looked exactly the same as it had this morning. A sturdy brick colonial surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges. But the illusion of safety had been shattered. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside the silent hallway. I did not bother turning on the lights. I walked straight down the corridor to my study, my shoes silent on the hardwood floors. I locked the study door behind me and sat at my heavy oak desk. My hands were remarkably steady now. The initial shock had burned away, leaving nothing but a cold, razor-sharp focus. I turned on my computer and watched the screen flicker to life. From my breast pocket, I retrieved the tiny micro SD card. I had an old digital camera adapter in my desk drawer. I slid the tiny black square into the adapter and plugged it into the computer port. A small folder icon popped up on the screen. It was simply labeled with the word truth. I double-clicked it. Inside were dozens of PDF files, scanned documents, and Excel spreadsheets. Evelyn had always been methodical, but the sheer volume of data she had compiled here was staggering. She had essentially conducted a full forensic audit of our entire financial lives. I opened the first document. It was a bank statement from a major national lender, a bank we had never done business with. My eyes scanned the top corner. It was addressed to George and Evelyn Keller, but the mailing address was a post office box I did not recognize. Then I looked at the balance. My breath caught in my throat. $450,000. It was a home equity line of credit. A massive loan borrowed against the value of this very house. My mind raced trying to process the numbers. Evelyn and I had paid off our mortgage 15 years ago. We had celebrated in the backyard with a bottle of cheap champagne, burning the final bank notice in a small fire pit. We owned this house free and clear. It was our ultimate security blanket for our old age. But according to the document on my screen, the house was now leveraged to the hilt. The funds had been fully drawn down over the course of 8 months. I opened the next file. It was a digital copy of the original loan application. I scrolled down to the signature page. There at the bottom was my signature. It looked flawless. The looping G, the sharp K. If I had not known better, I would have sworn I signed it myself. But right next to it was Evelyn's signature, and that is where the lie fell apart. Evelyn had a distinctive way of forming the descending stroke of the lowercase y in her first name. She drew a narrow loop beneath the line and curved it back toward the E. The signature on the application copied the general shape, but the loop ended abruptly. I opened the spreadsheets Evelyn had created. She had tracked the flow of the borrowed money with terrifying precision. The funds from the loan had been transferred into a shell account, and from there, they were bled dry through dozens of wire transfers. I followed the money trail. $50,000 wired to a luxury car dealership. That explained the brand new imported SUV Trevor had driven up to the house last Thanksgiving, claiming he got a massive corporate bonus. $75,000 wired to a high-risk investment firm. $30,000 to a high-end travel agency. The puzzle pieces snapped into place, forming a picture of breathtaking greed. Trevor, with his mid-level corporate job and his smooth-talking charm, had access to these kinds of financial instruments. He knew how to set up ghost accounts. He knew how to bypass standard verification protocols. and Brittany, my own flesh and blood, had provided him with the necessary personal information to steal our identities. They had used our paid-off home as their personal piggy bank to fund a lifestyle they could never afford on their own. I clicked on the final file in the folder. It was a scanned copy of an email correspondence between Trevor and a shady notary public whose license had apparently been revoked years ago. The email confirmed the payoff for stamping the forged loan documents without us being present. They had orchestrated a federal crime right under our noses. I sat back in my leather chair, the glow of the monitor, casting long shadows across my study. A suffocating silence filled the room. I closed my eyes and allowed the memories of Evelyns' final days to wash over me. I remembered how tired she looked that last week. I had asked her repeatedly if she was feeling all right. She had just smiled that gentle, reassuring smile and told me she was having trouble sleeping. I remembered finding her sitting at this very desk late at night, the soft light of the monitor reflecting in her tired eyes. She told me she was just organizing some old tax receipts. She was not organizing receipts. She was uncovering the destruction of our life savings by the child we had raised. She was tracing the fraudulent wires verifying the forged signatures and realizing that our daughter and son-in-law were willing to leave us destitute and homeless to fund their luxury vacations and designer clothes. The medical examiner had told me her stroke was massive and sudden. A catastrophic spike in blood pressure. They said these things just happen sometimes with age. But staring at the mountain of evidence she had gathered alone in the dark, I knew the truth. The sheer stress, the crushing weight of this ultimate betrayal had broken her heart before her brain finally gave out. Brittany and Trevor had not just stolen our equity. Their greed had killed my wife. A dark, heavy sorrow settled into my bones, but it was quickly swallowed by a rising tide of pure, unfiltered wrath. I did not cry. The time for weeping had passed when I buried Evelyn. What I felt now was a profound, lethal clarity. I looked at the date on the final bank statement. The monthly payments on the fraudulent loan had stopped 3 months ago. The money had run out. They had bled the account dry, and now they were defaulting on the payments. The reality of the situation was a ticking time bomb. The bank would not care that the signatures were forged unless I could prove it in a lengthy, expensive legal battle. With 3 months of missed payments, the bank was likely already preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings. Brittany and Trevor knew this. They knew the bomb was about to explode. That was why they were suddenly taking a trip to Cabo. They were distancing themselves from the blast radius while my house was pulled out from under me. I could call the police right now. I could hand over the memory card to a detective and watch the authorities drag them out of the airport in handcuffs. It would be easy. It would be swift. But it would not be enough. If I simply turned them in, they would hire a slick lawyer. Trevor would blame Brittany. Brittany would blame Trevor. They would play the victims. They would claim I gave them verbal permission and simply forgot in my old age. They would drag my name and Evelyns' memory through a messy public trial. No, I was not going to let the justice system handle this. The justice system was too clean, too sterile for a betrayal of this magnitude. They had treated me like a senile, helpless old man. They thought I was just a ghost haunting a valuable piece of real estate. They believed I was too weak to fight back, too stupid to understand what they had done. I was going to let them keep believing that. I was going to play the exact role they had written for me. I carefully ejected the micro SD card and slipped it back into my pocket. I deleted the history on my computer and shut it down. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain batter the glass. I was an architect. My entire career was built on understanding structures, finding the weak points, and engineering solutions that could withstand any pressure. My daughter and her husband had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies and forgery. I did not just want to knock it down. I wanted to lock the doors and set the entire structure on fire while they were still inside. The storm outside raged on, but inside my study, everything was perfectly still. The silent adjustment had begun. I would let them come back from Cabo with their tans and their fake smiles. I would let them try to maneuver me out of my own home. I would smile and nod and play the forgetful, grieving father. But every move they made would only tighten the noose I was about to wrap around their necks. Evelyn had given me the blueprint to their destruction. Now it was my turn to build the trap. I had to protect the evidence immediately. The safe in my study was no longer secure. Brittany had the combination, and if they suspected anything, it would be the very first place they would look to destroy proof. I went down to the basement, where my old architectural drafting tables were stored under heavy canvas tarps. Behind a tall wooden storage cabinet, there was a loose brick in the foundation wall. It was a secret structural cubby I had discovered years ago while inspecting a water leak, and I never bothered to patch it. I took the micro SD card, the printed bank statements, and Evelyn's handwritten note, placed them inside a watertight plastic bag, and shoved them deep into the dark cavity behind the brick. I slid the heavy cabinet back into place. The truth was now buried deep in the very bones of the house they were trying to steal. Walking back up the stairs, my knees ached. For the first time in my life, I felt the full physical weight of my 70 years. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water, leaning heavily against the marble counter. Evelyn and I had picked out this marble together 20 years ago. We argued over the color for an hour before finally settling on a dark granite that matched her eyes perfectly. Now I was standing alone in a home that had been stolen right out from under me by the child we brought into this world. I felt a profound, sickening guilt wash over my anger. How had I not seen it? How had I let my wife carry the brutal burden of discovering this monstrous betrayal all by herself? She died trying to protect me from the wolves we raised. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning white. I swore into the empty, silent kitchen that her ultimate sacrifice would not be in vain. The sharp, sudden buzz of my cell phone on the counter shattered the silence, making my heart rate spike. I stared at the illuminated screen. A message notification from Brittany. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath before picking it up. I had to practice my performance right now. I had to become the frail, clueless, grieving old man they believed me to be. I unlocked the screen and read the text. It was accompanied by a picture of Brittany and Trevor smiling widely, holding colorful drinks against a backdrop of pristine blue water and white sand. The very sand they had bought with the stolen equity of my home. "Hi, Daddy," the text began. The use of that childhood nickname made my stomach turn. "We are having a wonderful time, but I cannot stop thinking about you all alone in that big, empty house. Trevor and I were talking over breakfast, and we are both just so worried about you. Your health has not been great since Mom passed, and that house is just too much work for you to manage by yourself. It is not safe anymore. Let us have a serious family talk about your living situation as soon as we get back next week. We want to help you figure out a better, safer arrangement. Love you so much." I read the message 3 times. To anyone else, it would sound like the tender, genuine concern of a loving daughter looking out for her aging father. To me, it was a blatantly telegraphed threat. I saw the entire architecture of their plan laid out in those few innocent-looking sentences. A serious family talk about your living situation. They were not just running from the impending foreclosure, they were actively planning to remove me from the equation before the bank came knocking. If they could convince me that my mind was failing, that I was a danger to myself, they could legally step in. They would push me into an assisted living facility, claim medical power of attorney, and officially take control of the property. When the foreclosure happened, I would be locked away in a nursing home, heavily medicated, and completely isolated from my own finances. They would play the role of the devastated children who tried their absolute best to save their poor senile father's estate. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. They were going to use my grief against me. They thought my mourning was weakness. They thought my silence over the past few months was a sign of cognitive decline. They had no idea that my silence was just the quiet before the storm. I stared at the photo of them smiling on the sunny beach. Trevor with his expensive sunglasses reflecting the ocean. Brittany with her designer swimsuit. They looked so incredibly smug, so perfectly secure in their grand victory. I felt a cold, tight smile stretch across my own face. It was not a smile of joy or amusement. It was the smile of an architect watching a demolition crew unknowingly wire high-grade explosives to their own feet. I had to reply carefully. If I showed any anger or suspicion, they would abort their return flight and vanish into the wind. I needed to feed their massive ego. I needed to validate their arrogant assumption that I was losing my grip on reality. I carefully typed out my response, ensuring I used no punctuation and intentionally left a few spelling errors to make it look like the struggling, uncoordinated text of a confused elderly man. "Hi, sweetie." I typed slowly, my thumb hovering over the glass screen. "I am so glad you are having fun. You are right, the house feels too big, and I have been misplacing things a lot lately. Even lost my car keys yesterday for hours. A family talk sounds like a very good idea. I am tired and I think I need your help. Enjoy the sun. Love, Dad." I hit send. I placed the phone face down on the cold marble counter. The bait was in the water. I had just given them exactly what they wanted to hear. A full, unconditional surrender. A confirmation that I was weak, forgetful, and completely ready to hand over the reins of my life. They would read that message on their stolen vacation, and they would celebrate. They would clink their expensive glasses together and toast to their brilliant, flawless execution. They would board their flight back to Charlotte, completely confident that they were returning to an easy victory over a broken old man who did not have the strength to fight back. But they were not coming back to a victim. They were coming back to a predator who knew every single intricate detail of their crimes. The ticking clock of the bank foreclosure was no longer a threat to me. It was my strict deadline. I had exactly 60 days to dismantle their lives piece by piece, document by document. I needed to secure my remaining liquid assets, fortify my legal standing, and ensure that when the heavy hammer of justice fell, it only crushed them. I walked out of the kitchen and turned off the lights. The house was plunged into total darkness, but for the first time since Evelyn died, I knew exactly where I was going. They arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week after my text message. I heard the low, heavy rumble of Trevor's imported luxury vehicle pulling into the driveway. I stood by the front window watching them through the sheer white curtains. They stepped out of the SUV looking like they had just walked off a Hollywood movie set. Their skin was baked a deep golden bronze, which stood in stark contrast to the crisp white linen clothes they wore. They looked incredibly rested, completely unbothered by the severe federal crimes they had committed to afford that sunshine. I took a deep breath, forced my shoulders to slump forward, and shuffled toward the front door. Before I could even reach the handle, the door swung open. Brittany had used her spare key. "Daddy," she cried out, her voice dripping with an exaggerated syrupy sweetness that made my skin crawl. She threw her arms around my neck, pulling me into a tight embrace. She smelled of expensive coconut sunscreen and airport perfume. I let my arms wrap loosely around her back, playing the part of the weak, grateful father. "It is so good to see you," I murmured, making my voice sound thin and reedy. Trevor stepped in right behind her, carrying a small, colorful, duty-free shopping bag. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, flashing a bright white smile. "George, it is great to be back," he said heartily. "We missed you, old man. Cabo was beautiful, but we could not stop thinking about you all alone in this massive place." I offered him a wavering smile. "Come in," I said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Let me make us some coffee." I walked slowly down the hallway, intentionally dragging my left foot just a fraction of an inch to simulate a stiff joint. Brittany and Trevor exchanged a quick, triumphant look behind my back. I saw it clearly in the reflection of the hallway mirror. They followed me into the kitchen and sat at the marble island. While I fumbled with the coffee maker, I watched them out of the corner of my eye. The psychological manipulation began almost immediately. I had deliberately left a stack of mail on the edge of the counter. It was nothing important, just grocery circulars and a few basic utility bills. But mixed in there was a generic-looking envelope from a local bank. I watched in my peripheral vision as Trevor casually slid his hand over the stack. He smoothly slipped the bank envelope into his jacket pocket while pretending to admire the granite countertop. He thought he was intercepting a foreclosure notice. He thought he was saving their grand scheme from being discovered. I kept my back turned, acting completely oblivious as the coffee pot began to brew. Brittany took the next step in their coordinated attack. I placed a ceramic mug of black coffee in front of her. She took a sip and set it down near her left hand. I turned around to grab the cream from the refrigerator. When I turned back, the mug was gone. I blinked, staring at the empty space on the counter. "Where did your coffee go?" I asked, letting a note of genuine confusion seep into my voice. Brittany looked at me with wide, innocent eyes. "What coffee, Daddy?" she asked softly. I pointed at the counter. "The mug I just handed you," I said. Trevor chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. "George, you have not poured the coffee yet," he said, pointing to the coffee pot, which was still sitting on the heating plate. He had taken the mug and hidden it inside the lower cabinet while my back was turned. I stared at them, letting my mouth hang slightly open. I brought a trembling hand to my forehead. "I could have sworn I poured it," I whispered, rubbing my temples. Brittany reached out and patted my hand soothingly. "It is okay, Daddy," she cooed. "You have just been so tired lately. Your memory is slipping a little bit. It happens to everyone at your age. That is exactly why we wanted to have this talk." She looked around the kitchen, sighing deeply. "This house is just too much for you now. Look at all this space. It is collecting dust. You are forgetting things. What if you leave the stove on next time? What if you fall down those steep stairs and nobody is here to find you?" I sank heavily onto one of the bar stools, letting my head hang low. "You really think I am losing my grip?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to give them the ultimate satisfaction of breaking my spirit. Trevor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "George, we just want you to be safe," he said, using his best corporate negotiation voice. "You worked hard your whole life. You deserve to rest somewhere secure where professionals can monitor your health round the clock. We are worried sick about you living here isolated." They were laying the groundwork perfectly. Every word was deliberately designed to strip away my autonomy, to make me doubt my own mind. They were testing the waters to see how much resistance I would put up before they brought in the lawyers and the forged medical documents. I looked up at them with watery eyes. "Maybe you are right," I mumbled, looking down at my hands. "Maybe this place is too big. I just do not know what I would do with all Evelyns' things." "Do not you worry about any of that," Brittany said quickly, her eyes flashing with greedy anticipation. "Trevor and I will handle everything. We will sort through the house. We will take care of the paperwork. You will not have to lift a finger, Daddy. We just want you to relax and let us manage the heavy lifting." The sheer predatory nature of her promise made my blood run cold. They were volunteering to pack up my life and sell my memories, all while smiling to my face. I nodded slowly, offering them a defeated sigh. "You are good kids," I said, forcing the lie through my teeth. "Thank you for looking out for me." Trevor checked the heavy silver watch on his wrist, the expensive watch he had undoubtedly bought with the fraudulent equity loan. "Well, we should probably get going and unpack," he announced, standing up. "We have a lot of jet lag to sleep off. We will come by tomorrow and check on you, George. Drink some water and get some rest." Brittany kissed my cheek, leaving a smudge of pink lipstick near my jaw. "Think about what we said, Daddy," she whispered. "It is time for a change. We love you." I watched them walk out the front door. The heavy wood clicked shut, locking them outside. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, listening as the engine of their luxury SUV roared to life and faded down the quiet suburban street. The silence of the house rushed back in, but it was no longer a comforting silence. It was the silence of a battlefield after the enemy scouts had surveyed the perimeter. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders to release the tension of playing the frail victim. The performance was exhausting, but it had worked flawlessly. They were completely convinced that my mind was deteriorating. They had successfully stolen a utility bill, thinking they had intercepted the bank. They had played their pathetic parlor trick with the coffee mug. They walked away feeling like absolute masterminds. I walked over to the spot where Trevor had been sitting. He had left the duty-free shopping bag on the counter. I reached inside, pulling out a cheap bottle of tequila and a tacky souvenir magnet. But beneath the tissue paper at the very bottom of the bag lay something else. It was a glossy trifold brochure printed on thick, expensive paper. Trevor had not left it there by accident. He had planted it intentionally, hoping I would find it and begin to internalize the idea of leaving my home. I opened the brochure. The front cover featured a photo of smiling elderly people sitting in a sunlit courtyard. The title read, "Shady Pines Luxury Memory Care and Assisted Living." I scanned the interior pages. The language was carefully crafted to sound compassionate, but the details painted a deeply disturbing picture. The facility boasted state-of-the-art security protocols, restricted access wards for patients with cognitive decline, and full custodial care programs. My eyes zeroed in on a specific paragraph describing the admission process. It detailed how family members holding medical power of attorney could expedite the transfer of a loved one into their secure lockdown units for their own safety. Once a patient was admitted to the memory care ward, they were not permitted to leave the premises without authorized family consent. They would not have access to a personal telephone. They would not have access to their bank accounts. They would become a ghost, trapped in a sterile, expensive prison while their assets were liquidated on the outside to pay for their confinement. This was not just a retirement home. It was a holding cell. Trevor and Brittany were not planning to put me somewhere comfortable. They were planning to lock me away in a secure psychiatric ward where no one would ever listen to my complaints. If I tried to tell the nurses that my daughter stole my house, they would simply smile, pat my hand, and adjust my medication. I would be completely silenced, isolated, and erased from my own life. I stared at the glossy photos of the smiling residents, feeling a profound, icy rage harden into an unbreakable resolve. The brochure was not a suggestion. It was a death sentence disguised as a luxury resort. They had chosen my prison. They had scoped out the walls that would hold me while they stole the legacy I had built with the woman I loved. I slowly folded the brochure and placed it next to my coffee maker. I did not throw it away. I kept it right there on the counter as a stark, chilling reminder of exactly what was at stake. The time for waiting was over. The enemy had shown their hand, and now it was my turn to strike. The brochure confirmed what their behavior had already suggested. Brittany and Trevor were not merely encouraging me to move. They were building a case that I could no longer manage my own affairs. Gregory or another cooperative professional would describe me as confused. They would use that opinion to seek emergency control, and then they would try to sell the house before the fraudulent loan collapsed around them. The sequence was clear. Remove my independence. Control the property. Pay off the forged debt before the bank examined it too closely. Keep whatever remained. Fighting them immediately would only warn them that I understood the plan. I needed them confident enough to continue. To expose their intentions, I had to give them a convincing example of the decline they wanted to see. I looked toward the wooden hook beside the front door, where my car keys had hung for 30 years. Then I designed my first test. I took the heavy key ring down and carried it into the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator, pushed aside a carton of milk and a plastic container of vegetables, and placed the keys on the cold glass shelf beside a jar of strawberry jam. Then I closed the door. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for my audience to arrive. Brittany had promised they would come by to check on me again. I knew they would not be able to resist returning to evaluate the psychological damage they had inflicted earlier. 2 hours later, I heard the heavy engine of their luxury sport utility vehicle pulling into the driveway. I immediately began tearing through the living room. I pulled cushions off the sofa, throwing them onto the floor. I tossed magazines across the coffee table. I opened drawers and left them hanging wide open. When I heard the front door click open, I dropped to my hands and knees near the hallway console table, running my hands frantically over the carpet. "Daddy, what are you doing?" Brittany asked, her voice echoing down the hall. I heard the sharp click of her expensive sandals on the hardwood floor. I looked up at her, widening my eyes and forcing my breathing to become rapid and shallow. "I cannot find them," I stammered, letting my voice crack with genuine-sounding panic. "I have to go to the hardware store, but I cannot find them anywhere." "Find what?" Trevor asked, stepping up behind his wife. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking down at me with an expression of thinly veiled amusement. "My car keys," I said, scrambling to my feet and leaning heavily against the console table. "I always put them on the hook. Evelyn always made sure I put them on the hook. But they are not there. Someone took them. I need to drive to the store." Brittany stepped forward and put a patronizing hand on my shoulder. "Daddy, calm down," she said softly. "Nobody took your keys. You probably just set them down somewhere and forgot. Let us help you look." They began to search the living room, making a great show of helping the poor, confused old man. I paced back and forth, muttering incoherently, rubbing my face with trembling hands. I watched Trevor walk into the kitchen out of the corner of my eye. I heard the squeak of the refrigerator door opening. A few seconds of silence passed. Then I heard a low, cruel chuckle echo from the kitchen. "Hey, Britt!" Trevor called out, a wide, smug grin evident in his voice. "Come look at this." Brittany walked into the kitchen, and I shuffled nervously behind her. Trevor was standing in front of the open refrigerator, holding my keyring dangling from his index finger. "Found them, George," he announced, tossing the keys onto the marble island. They were sitting right next to the strawberry jam. "Were you trying to keep your car cold, old man?" I stared at the keys, my mouth hanging slightly open. I brought both hands to my face, shaking my head in slow, exaggerated disbelief. "No," I whispered. "I would not put them in the refrigerator." "Why would I put them in the refrigerator? That does not make any sense." Brittany sighed deeply, casting a meaningful, victorious glance at Trevor. "It is getting worse, Daddy," she said, wrapping her arms around me in a suffocating fake hug. "You are getting confused. It is dangerous for you to be driving anyway. What if you forget where you are going? What if you get lost? Trevor is going to hold on to these keys for a few days, just to be safe." I let out a broken, pathetic sob, burying my face in my hands. "Do not take my car," I pleaded, playing this part of a broken man losing his independence. "Please, I just got confused. I will be better." "It is for your own good," Trevor said, pocketing the keys. "We will talk about all of this tomorrow. Try to get some sleep." They walked out the front door, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen. The moment the lock clicked shut, my trembling stopped. The tears dried instantly. My posture straightened, and the pathetic facade melted away completely. I walked over to this window and watched their vehicle drive away. They had stolen my keys, but they had surrendered their only strategic advantage. They thought the game was over. They thought they had successfully broken my mind and secured their path to guardianship. I smiled a cold, hard smile into the empty room. They had taken the bait perfectly. Now that they believed I was completely defenseless, it was time for me to go to work. I spent the entire morning setting the stage for my own psychological execution. An architect knows that a successful facade relies entirely on the small supporting details. If my daughter and her husband wanted to convince a judge that my mind was crumbling, I needed to provide them with a flawless physical exhibition of decay. I took the morning newspaper and placed it carefully inside the oven. I took my favorite pair of reading glasses and dropped them into the kitchen trash can right on top of the coffee grounds. I walked into the living room and turned the framed photographs of Evelyn face down on the mantel. Finally, I unbuttoned my cardigan, matching it unevenly, so the left side hung 2 inches lower than the right. I did not bathe. I did not shave. I sat in my armchair, staring blankly at the dark television screen, waiting for the vultures to arrive. They did not bother to knock. I heard the sharp metallic scrape of the spare key turning in the front door lock. The heavy wooden door creaked open, letting in the bright afternoon sunlight. I did not turn my head. I maintained my vacant stare perfectly still. Daddy, Brittany called out. Her voice was laced with that same artificial syrup she had used the day before. We brought a friend over to say hello. I slowly turned my head, blinking, as if my eyes could not process the light. Brittany and Trevor stood in the foyer. Beside them was a man I had never seen before. He looked to be in his late 40s, wearing a casual polo shirt and expensive khaki pants. He carried a leather satchel that looked suspiciously like a medical bag disguised for a weekend outing. George, Trevor said, stepping into the living room with a wide, predatory smile. This is my good friend Gregory. We were just finishing up a round of golf nearby, and I told him he absolutely had to meet you. Gregory is a huge fan of mid-century architecture. I told him all about the buildings you designed downtown. I knew exactly what this was. Gregory was not a golfing buddy. Gregory was the corrupt medical professional they had recruited to secure their fraudulent guardianship. He was here to conduct an informal, off-the-books psychiatric evaluation. He would ask me a series of seemingly casual questions, document my failures, and provide the legal foundation they needed to lock me away in a secure facility. I stood up slowly, letting my knees tremble. I offered Gregory a weak, confused smile. It is nice to meet you, I said, my voice raspy and uncertain. Did Evelyn offer you something to drink? She usually makes lemonade when we have guests. A heavy silence fell over the room. Evelyn had been dead for quite some time. I saw Brittany exchange a rapid, victorious glance with Trevor. Gregory offered a soft, compassionate smile that made my stomach turn. No thank you, George, Gregory said, stepping closer and extending his hand. Trevor tells me you have been feeling a little under the weather lately. How are you holding up? I shook his hand limply. Oh, you know, I mumbled, looking down at the carpet. The days just kind of blur together. Sometimes I forget if I have eaten breakfast. I looked up at Brittany with wide, terrified eyes. Did I eat breakfast today, sweetie? Brittany rushed forward, wrapping a comforting arm around my unevenly buttoned cardigan. Oh, Daddy, she sighed, stroking my uncombed hair. We will get you something to eat soon. Why do you not sit back down? I sank back into the armchair. Gregory took a seat on the sofa directly across from me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He began his evaluation disguised as polite conversation. He asked me about my old architecture firm. I intentionally gave him the wrong name, mixing up my former partners with people who had died 20 years ago. He asked me what year I retired. I told him 1992, which was off by a full decade. He laughed warmly and asked if I had been watching any good baseball games lately, playfully testing my awareness of the current season. I stared at him blankly and asked if the Brooklyn Dodgers had played yet. The Brooklyn Dodgers had not existed since the 1950s. With every deliberate mistake I made, I could see Gregory forming his clinical diagnosis. He watched my shaking hands. He noted the uneven buttons on my sweater. I saw his eyes drift toward the kitchen, where the morning newspaper was clearly visible, sitting behind the glass door of the oven. He was building his case file in his head, cataloging every piece of manufactured evidence I handed him. Trevor leaned against the doorframe, watching the performance with absolute satisfaction. I thought he had outsmarted a brilliant man. He thought his corporate maneuvering and his hired doctor were securing him a $1 million payday. He had no idea he was standing in the middle of a trap I had designed specifically for him. After 45 minutes of playing the senile victim, I let my head drop back against the armchair and closed my eyes. I am just so tired, I whispered, letting a genuine note of exhaustion slip into my voice. Playing the fool was deeply draining work. I think I need to take a nap. Of course, George Gregory said, his voice dripping with fake professional sympathy. It was a pleasure meeting you. You just rest. Brittany kissed my forehead, telling me they would let me sleep and that they would be back tomorrow to check on me. I kept my eyes closed, listening as they walked out of the living room. I heard them whispering in the foyer before the front door opened. I caught fragments of the hushed voice of Gregory. He said I was in advanced stages of total disorientation. He told Trevor he was willing to write a preliminary opinion describing me as disoriented evidence they intended to attach to an emergency guardianship petition. He reassured them that they were doing the right thing because I was a danger to myself. The front door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid into place. I opened my eyes. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. I stood up from the armchair, my posture perfectly straight. I walked to the window and watched the luxury vehicle belonging to Trevor pull out of the driveway, carrying the three of them away. They were driving off to finalize their paperwork to count the money they believed was already theirs. I did not waste a single second. I walked directly to the basement, descending the wooden stairs with firm, steady steps. I moved the heavy storage cabinet away from the foundation wall and reached into the dark cavity behind the loose brick. My fingers brushed the watertight plastic bag. I pulled it out, gripping the evidence that would destroy them. The memory card, the fraudulent bank statements, and the final handwritten note from Evelyn were all perfectly safe. I walked back upstairs and went straight to the bathroom. I washed my face, shaving the rough stubble from my jaw. I combed my hair back into its usual neat style. I took off the unevenly buttoned cardigan and put on a tailored navy blue suit. I took my favorite watch from my dresser and strapped it to my wrist. The confused, grieving widower was gone. The architect had returned to the site. I took my spare car keys from the lockbox in my bedroom, since Trevor had stolen my primary set the day before. I walked out the back door, stepping into the cool afternoon air. I got into my old sedan and started the engine. I backed out of the driveway, heading in the exact opposite direction of the airport and the golf courses. I drove directly to the financial district of downtown Charlotte. I pulled into the private parking garage of the most ruthless estate law firm in the state. Stanton was not a friendly lawyer. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who destroyed corporate fraudsters for a living. Evelyn and I had retained him 20 years ago to draft our initial wills because we knew he was meticulous and unforgiving. I walked into the polished marble lobby of his firm, bypassing the receptionist entirely. I knew exactly where his office was. I pushed open his heavy glass door unannounced. Stanton looked up from his desk, his sharp gray eyes narrowing behind his silver-rimmed glasses. "George," he said, his voice surprised but respectful. "I do not have you on my schedule today. What brings you here?" I walked across the expensive Persian rug and placed the watertight plastic bag directly in the center of his mahogany desk. I unzipped the seal, pulling out the memory card and the forged loan documents. "I need you to freeze every asset I own, Stanton." I said, my voice hard and resonant. "I need you to build an impenetrable blind trust by the end of business today. And then I need you to prepare a federal wire fraud brief for the authorities. My daughter and her husband are trying to steal my home and lock me in a psychiatric ward." Stanton slowly lowered his pen. He looked at the documents on his desk and then looked up at me, his expression shifting from surprise to cold professional calculation. "Sit down, George," he said, pointing to the leather chair across from him. "Tell me exactly what they did." I sat down, crossing my legs. I took a deep breath, ready to lay out the blueprints of my revenge. The time for playing the fool was over. It was time to tear their world apart. The door to Stanton's office closed behind me with a muted hydraulic hiss, sealing us away from the polished activity of the law firm outside. Stanton did not immediately touch the memory card or the forged loan documents. He pressed a button beneath his desk, instructed his assistant to cancel his remaining appointments, and asked her to bring in Martin Hale, the firm's senior forensic banking specialist. That small action told me he understood the danger. I sat across from him and described everything from the beginning. I told him about the empty velvet box, Brittany's casual confession swan from the airport lounge, Leo discovering the hidden compartment, and Evelyns' handwritten warning. Then I explained the plan. Brittany and Trevor appeared to be building around me the missing mail, the hidden coffee mug, the assisted living brochure, the staged concern about my memory, and Gregory's fraudulent evaluation. Stanton listened without interrupting. His expression remained almost perfectly neutral, but his right hand tightened slowly around his pen when I described Trevor taking my car keys and Gregory promising to sign an incompetence affidavit. When I finished, Stanton placed the pen flat on his desk. "George, there are 3 separate threats here," he said. "The first is the fraudulent home equity line of credit. The second is the attempted seizure of your legal authority. The third is the immediate risk that they will destroy evidence or move the remaining proceeds once they realize you are alert." He turned toward the computer beside him and inserted Evelyns' memory card into an isolated reader that was not connected to the firm's main network. He did not open the original files directly. Instead, he created a forensic image of the card, generated a digital checksum, and sealed the original in a transparent evidence sleeve. "We preserved the original exactly as Leo found it," he explained. "No edits, no renamed files, no accidental changes to the metadata. From this moment forward, every person who handles that card signs a chain of custody record." Martin Hale entered a few minutes later, carrying a laptop and a portable document scanner. He was a compact, serious man with close-cropped gray hair and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to finding lies hidden inside columns of numbers. Stanton introduced us, summarized the situation, and handed him copies of the loan documents. Martin examined the signatures first. He compared the application with a scanned copy of our original mortgage release, Evelyns' will, and several older documents already stored in Stanton's estate file. "The reproductions are technically impressive," he said, "but they are reproductions. The pressure patterns are too uniform. These signatures appear to have been digitally traced and transferred rather than written naturally." He enlarged the signature attributed to Evelyn. My throat tightened as her name filled the screen. Evelyn had always formed the descending stroke of the lowercase letter Y, with a narrow loop that curved back toward the first letter of her surname. The forged version copied the general shape, but the loop ended abruptly. Whoever created it had copied the appearance of her handwriting without understanding the motion behind it. Martin then opened the transaction records Evelyn had saved. He followed the money from the fraudulent credit line into the post office box account, then into 2 shell companies, a luxury vehicle dealership, a travel agency, and several high-risk investment platforms. "This is not a family misunderstanding," he said quietly. "This is structured movement of fraudulently obtained funds." Stanton rose and walked to a locked cabinet built into the wall. He removed our original estate binder and laid it on the desk. Inside were my will, the deed records for the house insurance documents, retirement accounts, and the durable powers Evelyn and I had created years earlier. "The first thing we do is revoke every prior authorization that could possibly be misused," Stanton said. "Even if Brittany does not currently possess a valid power of attorney, we eliminate any argument that she believed she did." He drafted a formal revocation naming Brittany and Trevor as unauthorized parties. He also prepared notices for my bank's brokerage accounts, insurance carriers, the county register of deeds, and the lender holding the fraudulent equity line. Each notice instructed the recipient that no transfer, mortgage, sale, withdrawal, or change of beneficiary could be accepted without direct confirmation through Stanton's office and an in-person identification procedure. Next, he created an emergency asset protection plan. My checking account would remain open with only enough money for ordinary household expenses. The majority of my liquid savings and investment accounts would be transferred into a revocable trust administered by an independent corporate trustee. I would remain the beneficiary and retain the right to direct lawful distributions, but Brittany and Trevor would have no access even if they obtained a questionable medical letter or attempted to present a fraudulent power of attorney. Stanton was careful with his terminology. "This does not make your money disappear," he told me. "It creates a documented barrier. Anyone trying to reach these assets must go through a regulated trustee that already knows there is suspected elder exploitation." He also arranged for a licensed geriatric psychiatrist with no connection to my family to examine me that afternoon. At first, the suggestion angered me. I had spent days deliberately pretending to be confused. The idea of proving my sanity to a stranger felt humiliating. Stanton understood my reaction. "Gregory will claim you were disoriented," he said. "We do not answer a corrupt opinion with indignation. We answer it with a legitimate evaluation, recorded observations, and standardized testing performed by an independent physician." The psychiatrist arrived at the firm shortly after lunch. She asked me the date, the location, the names of current public officials, and details about my medical history. She tested my short-term recall reasoning, spatial judgment, and ability to understand financial decisions. She asked why I wanted to trust, what property I owned, and what risks I believed I faced. I answered every question clearly. At the end of the evaluation, she stated that I demonstrated full orientation, intact memory, strong executive function, and a detailed understanding of my legal and financial affairs. She found no evidence that I lacked capacity. Stanton requested a signed report and a video-recorded statement confirming her findings. "That neutralizes Gregory's affidavit before it is ever filed," he said, after she left. But the fraudulent loan still hung over the house. Stanton called the lender's internal fraud department from a secure conference room. He did not accuse this bank of participating in the crime. He calmly notified them that the loan application contained forged signatures, that an evidence preservation demand was being delivered, and that any foreclosure activity should be suspended while the matter was investigated. The bank would not erase the debt immediately. Its lawyers needed time to verify the fraud. But this notification prevented the institution from later claiming that it had never been warned. It also forced the bank to preserve call recordings, online access logs, identification documents, notary records, IP addresses, and internal approval notes. Martin explained that those records could reveal exactly who submitted the application and from what device. "We should not alert Trevor yet," I said. "If he learns the bank has frozen the process, he may run." Stanton nodded. "That is why the fraud notice is confidential. The lender has been instructed not to contact the suspected borrowers directly." He then addressed the most dangerous part of the plan, Trevor's next move. Trevor believed I was mentally deteriorating. He believed the bank was approaching foreclosure. He also believed he needed legal authority to sell the house quickly. That pressure would force him to act before he had time to examine every document carefully. "We are not going to manufacture evidence," Stanton said firmly. "We are going to give him an opportunity to reveal what he is already attempting to do." He prepared a written notice of restricted authority. The document stated that I had not granted Trevor control over my property and that any attempt by Trevor to mortgage, sell, transfer, or manage the house would be unauthorized. Beneath that notice was an acknowledgement section for anyone claiming to act as my fiduciary. By signing it, that person would certify that he had reviewed the existing equity loan, knew about the disputed funds, and was nevertheless attempting to exercise control over my real estate. Stanton placed the notice inside a set of ordinary-looking property tax papers. "If Trevor brings you documents, do not sign a power of attorney," he instructed. "You may sign only the harmless acknowledgement form we have prepared. If he signs the fiduciary certification without reading it, that is his decision. It will document his knowledge and intent without transferring a single legal right." I studied the document carefully until I understood every line. Stanton also gave me a small digital recorder permitted under North Carolina's one-party consent law. I was to activate it only during conversations in which I was personally participating. He warned me not to provoke threats or make statements that were untrue. My role was simply to let Trevor speak. Do not improvise beyond the plan, he said. Your advantage is that they believe you are helpless. Keep that advantage until the evidence and the protective orders are secure. By late afternoon, the trust documents were signed and witnessed. The independent medical evaluation had been completed. The banks and county offices had received fraud alerts. My original evidence was sealed. Copies had been created for investigators, and Stanton had begun preparing a referral package for the appropriate financial crimes authorities. Before I left, he handed me a slim folder containing the restricted authority acknowledgement and a copy of my valid capacity report. Your house is not completely safe yet, he said. But your daughter and her husband can no longer take it quietly. Every door they try to open now has an alarm attached to it. I stood and buttoned my jacket. For the first time since reading Evelyns' note, the pressure in my chest loosened slightly. I had entered Stanton's office believing I possessed only evidence of a betrayal. I left with something far more powerful. A preserved chain of custody, independent proof of my competence-protected assets. Formal fraud notices and a legal structure designed to survive every lie Brittany and Trevor were preparing to tell. They still believed they were building a cage around me. They had no idea Stanton and I had already reinforced the walls from the outside. The next several days passed beneath a heavy weight of anticipation. I kept busy in the garage organizing Evelyns' gardening tools while Stanton completed the fraud alerts and protected my remaining assets. Trevor still believed the approaching loan default gave him only a narrow window to seize control of the house. Sooner or later, that pressure would force him to return. I watched him pull into the driveway on a rainy Thursday morning. His luxury vehicle lurched to a halt, entirely misaligned with the concrete borders. He stepped out into the drizzle without an umbrella. His usual immaculate presentation was cracking. His tie was loosened, his hair was unkempt, and he was furiously typing on his cell phone as he walked up the path. The walls were closing in on him. The corporate manager who thought he could outsmart the banking system was realizing that institutional gravity always wins. I shuffled into the living room and sat in my armchair, draping a knitted blanket over my knees. The front door opened with a sudden, harsh force. Trevor did not bother calling out a greeting. He walked straight into the living room, his chest heaving slightly. He carried a slim leather portfolio under his arm, and his eyes darted around the room with a frantic, nervous energy. "George," he said, his voice lacking the syrupy patience he usually deployed. "We have a situation with the county tax assessor." I blinked at him, pulling the knitted blanket tighter around my waist. "The tax assessor," I murmured, letting my voice waver. "Did I forget to pay the property taxes? Evelyn usually handles the taxes." Trevor let out a sharp, agitated breath. He paced across the carpet, running a hand over his face. No, you did not forget," he lied smoothly, forcing his tone into a reassuring cadence. "But because you are on a fixed income now, there is a senior exemption you need to claim. The deadline is today, George. If we do not file this exemption, the county is going to reassess the property value and your taxes will skyrocket. You could lose the house." It was a brilliant, terrifying manipulation. He was using my home as leverage, creating a manufactured crisis to force an immediate reaction. He unzipped the leather portfolio and pulled out a small stack of papers. They were printed on official-looking, legal-sized paper, complete with complex barcodes and municipal seals. He had clearly gone to great lengths to make them look authentic. "I just need you to sign this application," Trevor pressed, stepping closer to the armchair and offering me a pen. "I have already filled out all your personal information. I will drive it down to the county clerk myself right now. We can get this handled and you will not have to worry about a thing." I reached out with a trembling hand and took the documents. I stared at the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. Trevor had cleverly sandwiched the true document between two legitimate-looking tax forms. The second page was the weapon. It was an absolute, unconditional, durable financial power of attorney. It granted Trevor full unilateral authority to sell, mortgage, or liquidate any real estate holdings in my name without my presence or verbal consent. It was the master key to my entire life. "These letters are so small," I whispered, squinting at the page. "My eyes are just not what they used to be. Do I really need to sign all of this?" Trevor dropped to one knee beside my chair, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled of stale coffee and raw panic. "Yes, George," he insisted, his voice tight with desperation. "You need to sign right there at the bottom. If you do not sign it, the government is going to penalize you. I am trying to protect you here. You have to let me protect you." I looked into his eyes. There was no soul there. There was only a ravenous, consuming greed that had blinded him to everything else. He was willing to strip a grieving 70-year-old man of his only shelter, just to cover his own monumental failures. "Okay, Trevor," I murmured softly. "If you say it is important, I will sign." I placed the documents on my knee and adjusted the leather portfolio beneath them. Stanton had warned me not to place my signature anywhere on a document that purported to grant Trevor authority. A strange signature would not necessarily save me. Intent mattered, and Trevor's lawyer could argue that I had knowingly approved the transfer, despite the irregular handwriting. The protection Stanton had prepared was much cleaner. Hidden between the two property tax forms was not a power of attorney signed by me. It was a notice of restricted authority stating that no person, including Trevor or Brittany, had permission to sell mortgage transfer or manage my real estate. Beneath the notice was a separate certification for any person claiming to act as my fiduciary. By signing that certification, the claimant acknowledged the disputed equity loan, accepted responsibility for presenting the documents, and confirmed that he was attempting to exercise control over my property. To a rushed reader, the page looked like another dense county form. To Stanton, it was a written record of knowledge and intent. I signed the legitimate tax form on the first page. On the second page, I signed only the line marked "Property Owner's Acknowledgement of Receipt." I did not sign the blank labeled "Grant of Authority" because no such authority was being given. Then I signed the final tax form. There, I said, allowing the pen to slide from my fingers. "Did I do what you needed?" Trevor snatched the papers from my lap. He checked the first and last pages, saw my signature, and assumed the middle document gave him what he wanted. His panic and arrogance prevented him from reading the heading directly above my acknowledgement. But the certification beneath it required his signature. "You missed one," I murmured, tapping the bottom of the middle page. "It says the person helping me has to sign too." Trevor barely looked at the language. He saw the words "acting fiduciary representative" and interpreted them as confirmation of the power he was trying to seize. He pulled out his own pen and signed Trevor Lawson in a large, confident hand. He added the date and his corporate telephone number, then initialed the box stating that he had reviewed the property's existing financial obligations. The moment his pen left the paper, the evidence was complete. He had not received authority over my house. He had signed a written certification acknowledging the disputed loan and documenting his attempt to act as my fiduciary, despite having no lawful appointment. Trevor zipped the papers into his portfolio and rose quickly. "You did the right thing, George," he said. "I'll take care of everything from here." He walked out without offering a hug or even pretending to care about my health. Through the front window, I watched him hurry toward his vehicle, clutching the portfolio against his side as though it contained the deed to my entire life. When his car disappeared, I went to my study and called Stanton. "It is done," I said. He signed the restricted authority certification. He also initialed the acknowledgement of the disputed financial obligation. "Did you sign any grant of authority?" Stanton asked. "No." "Good. Then he possesses no power of attorney, no deed, and no lawful right to manage the property. What he does possess is a document bearing his own signature that establishes knowledge and attempted control." Stanton explained that his office would immediately send copies of the signed certification to the lender's fraud division and preserve the recording of Trevor's false tax explanation. If Trevor presented the packet to a bank broker, title company, or county office, the fraud alerts already in place would stop the transaction and record exactly where he attempted to use it. "The trap is armed," Stanton said. "But remember, George, we are documenting his existing crime. We are not giving him authority, and we are not manufacturing a new one." I hung up and looked around the quiet study where Evelyn had spent her final nights gathering evidence. She had provided the foundation. Stanton had reinforced it. And Trevor had just placed his own signature on the first wall of the cage. Friday morning brought a brittle, freezing wind that swept through the empty streets of Charlotte. I drove downtown with a singular focus gripping the steering wheel of my old sedan. Stanton had called me late Thursday night with a final strategic directive. The federal wire fraud brief was nearly complete, and the blind trust was fully operational. But Stanton was a man who left no exposed flanks. He warned me that Trevor's defense attorney would inevitably attack the origin of our most damaging evidence. They would claim that the memory card was a complete fabrication. They would argue that a vengeful, senile old man had purchased a micro-storage drive, typed up fake financial spreadsheets, and planted it all to frame his loving daughter and son-in-law. I needed an unbreakable chain of custody. I needed an impartial third-party witness who could legally verify exactly where and how that memory card was discovered. I parked down the street from Leo's Golden Pawn. The bell above the heavy glass door chimed as I stepped inside the shop. The air smelled of old brass and industrial polishing wax. Leo was standing behind the main display counter, meticulously wiping down a silver serving tray with a microfiber cloth. He looked up and recognized me instantly. The professional neutrality on his face shifted immediately into an expression of deep, genuine concern. He put down the tray and walked over to the edge of the counter. He asked me how I was holding up, and if I had found the answers I was looking for inside the medallion. I stood in front of the glass case looking at this man who had unwittingly handed me the key to my own salvation. I told him I found exactly what I needed, but that the truth was far worse than I had anticipated. I kept the details of the federal bank fraud to myself, but I explained the core of the situation. I told him my daughter was attempting to have me declared mentally incompetent to seize my estate. I explained that her lawyers would undoubtedly accuse me of inventing the hidden compartment in the necklace and fabricating the memory card to ruin her life. I looked Leo directly in the eyes and asked him for a massive favor. I asked him if he would be willing to draft and sign a sworn legal affidavit. I needed him to detail his exact process of cleaning the gold pendant. I needed him to describe in his own words how the hidden spring mechanism triggered under pressure and how he personally used his tweezers to extract the folded note and the memory card from the hollow cavity. Leo did not hesitate for a single second. He was a man who made his living analyzing the value of things, and he clearly had a strict moral compass when it came to thieves and liars. He pulled a fresh pad of legal paper from beneath the register and grabbed a heavy black pen. He told me he despised people who preyed on the elderly, and that he would gladly swear under oath in any courtroom I needed. I watched in quiet gratitude as he carefully wrote out his statement, detailing every mechanical click of the medallion and every item he pulled from inside. He signed the bottom of the page with a bold, sweeping signature and pushed the paper across the glass counter toward me. I folded the affidavit and slid it into my breast pocket, thanking him for his integrity. I turned to leave, feeling a solid wave of relief. The legal foundation of my case was now completely bulletproof. But as I reached for the door handle, Leo called out my name, stopping me in my tracks. He asked me to wait just a moment. He walked out from behind the counter and pointed a calloused finger toward the upper corner of the room. Tucked discreetly behind a wooden support beam was a small black dome camera. Leo explained that in his line of work, security was not just a precaution, it was a necessity. He told me his system did not just capture high-definition video of the sales counter. It also recorded crystal-clear audio of every single transaction to protect him against fraudulent sellers. Leo looked at me with a grim, serious expression. He said, if my daughter was going to try and call me a liar in a court of law, I might want to see and hear exactly what she said when she stood in my exact spot 2 days ago. My heart hammered a heavy, slow rhythm against my ribs. I followed Leo behind the velvet curtain and into his cramped back office. The room was illuminated by the glow of a large security monitor on his desk. Leo clicked his mouse, navigating through a series of digital archives until he found the timestamp from Tuesday afternoon. He maximized the video window and turned up the volume on the small desktop speakers. The screen flickered and then stabilized. I saw the interior of the pawn shop from a high downward angle. The heavy glass door opened, and Brittany walked into the frame. She was wearing her expensive designer sunglasses and carrying her expensive leather handbag. She looked impatient, tapping her manicured nails against the glass counter while she waited for Leo to approach. I watched my daughter pull the familiar burgundy velvet box from her bag and slap it onto the counter. Her voice echoed through the small speakers, filling the back office with a cold, arrogant tone. She demanded quick cash, telling Leo she was not interested in haggling over historical value. She just wanted the scrap weight price for the gold. On the video, I heard Leo ask her if she was sure she wanted to part with such a beautiful vintage piece. He asked her if it held any sentimental family value. Brittany let out a harsh metallic laugh that made my stomach turn. I stared at the screen as my own flesh and blood leaned against the counter and smiled. She told Leo it belonged to her clueless dad, who just sat around his big empty house all day staring at the walls. She explicitly bragged that she had memorized the combination to his safe years ago and that she simply slipped the box into her purse while he was taking a nap in his armchair. She called me a pathetic burden. She told Leo that she and her husband Trevor desperately needed the cash to fund a luxury trip to Cabo, because dealing with my declining mental state was just so incredibly stressful for them. She stood there laughing about stealing her dead mother's heirloom to buy expensive margaritas on a beach. She freely admitted to a felony theft on a high-definition security recording. She painted herself as the long-suffering victim of a senile old man, completely unaware that she was verbally signing her own criminal conviction. I stood in the cramped back office feeling the last remaining shred of paternal mercy evaporate from my soul. The woman on that screen was not my daughter. She was a parasite perfectly willing to devour the host that had kept her alive and comfortable her entire life. I did not feel sadness anymore. I only felt a cold, absolute certainty. Leo paused the video, leaving Brittany's smug, laughing face frozen on the monitor. He did not say a word. He simply opened a desk drawer, pulled out a blank digital thumb drive, and plugged it into his computer. He copied the entire unedited video file onto the drive, ensuring the audio track was perfectly preserved. He ejected the small silver drive and handed it to me. He told me to take the video to my lawyer and to crush them. I took the thumb drive, feeling the cold metal against my palm. I slipped it into my pocket, right next to the sworn affidavit. I shook Leo's hand one final time, thanking him for giving me the exact ammunition I needed to finish the war. I walked out of the pawn shop and stepped into the cool afternoon air of the city. The sky was bright and clear. The trap was no longer just a theory or a collection of forged documents. I had the financial records. I had the corrupted power of attorney. I had the sworn witness statement. And now I had a high-definition video confession of the theft itself. Every possible exit route Trevor and Brittany could try to take was now blocked by a massive wall of undeniable evidence. I walked to my car with the steady, measured stride of an architect who had just completed the final structural inspection of a flawless design. The foundation was solid. The walls were reinforced. The demolition was ready to begin. The invitation arrived via a text message on Saturday morning. It was a brightly worded request for a special family dinner at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Charlotte. Brittany framed it as a celebration of family and a chance to catch up properly after their long vacation. I read the message sitting at my heavy oak desk with the sworn pawn shop affidavit and the silver thumb drive resting right next to my phone. They had set the stage for their grand finale. They wanted a public setting, an expensive atmosphere where they believed I would be too embarrassed or too confused to make a scene when they dropped the heavy hammer. I replied with a simple confirmation maintaining my manufactured persona of a docile, obedient elder waiting for instructions. I spent the entire afternoon preparing my own materials. I placed the forged bank loan document, the forensic financial audit, the corrupted power of attorney, copy, the sworn affidavit, and the thumb drive into a plain manila folder. I dressed with deliberate intention. I wore an oversized tweed blazer that made my shoulders look frail and stooped. I combed my hair flat against my scalp and allowed my hands to retain a slight nervous tremble as I called a cab to take me downtown. I was walking into the ambush fully armed, but I needed them to believe they were hunting an unarmed victim. The entire architectural integrity of my revenge depended on them feeling utterly invincible right up until the floor collapsed beneath them. The restaurant was a cavernous, dimly lit establishment that smelled of roasted garlic, seared meat, and expensive bourbon. Heavy velvet curtains draped the tall windows, and the low murmur of wealthy patrons provided a steady background hum. I spotted them immediately. They were seated at a prime corner booth near the back, ensuring privacy for their ambush. Trevor was wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a smug, relaxed expression. Brittany sat beside him wearing a silk blouse and sipping from a large glass of deep red wine. The wine they were effortlessly charging to my stolen equity. I shuffled toward their table, letting my feet drag heavily across the thick carpet. I kept my gaze lowered, acting overwhelmed by the loud, bustling environment. Trevor stood up and offered a firm, patronizing handshake, while Brittany leaned over the table to offer a quick, hollow kiss on my cheek. "Daddy," she cooed, gesturing for me to slide into the leather booth across from them. "I am so glad you felt up to coming out tonight. You look a little tired, though." I settled into the booth, letting out a long, weary sigh. "The cab ride was a bit bumpy," I murmured, staring blankly at the polished silverware and the pristine white napkins. "I am just trying to keep up with you two. My head has been swimming all day." Trevor chuckled, a rich, booming sound that grated against my nerves. "Well, George, we wanted to treat you to something nice. You deserve a good meal. And we have some very exciting news to share with you tonight. News that is going to make your life infinitely easier and much more comfortable for the long term." The waiter approached our table, interrupting Trevor's rehearsed monologue. He offered to take our drink orders and walk us through the evening specials. Trevor confidently ordered an expensive reserve scotch and another glass of imported wine for Brittany, acting every bit the successful corporate titan. I quietly asked for a glass of tap water, holding the menu with visibly shaking hands. Trevor smiled, waving the waiter away and leaning forward across the crisp white tablecloth. He laced his fingers together, adopting the posture of a benevolent executive managing a difficult, stubborn employee. "George, we have been doing a lot of deep thinking since we got back from Cabo." Trevor began, his voice low and soothing. "We look at you and we see a man who has worked incredibly hard his entire life. A man who built a beautiful family and a wonderful career. But we also see a man who is struggling on a daily basis. You are forgetting things, George. You are leaving the house a mess. The constant maintenance on that property is simply too much for you to bear alone anymore. It is becoming a serious hazard." Brittany reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was warm, but her touch felt like a block of ice. "Daddy, we cannot sleep at night worrying about you," she said, her eyes widening in a display of practiced theatrical concern. "We worry you are going to fall down those stairs. We worry you are going to wander outside and hurt yourself. We want you to be safe and happy where professionals can tend to your needs." Trevor reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out the glossy trifold brochure, the exact same brochure he had planted in my kitchen days ago. He slid it slowly across the white tablecloth, stopping right in front of my water glass. It was the prospectus for Shady Pines Luxury Memory Care. "We have taken the liberty of handling all the complicated details for you, George," Trevor said, his chest puffing out with absolute arrogant pride. "We toured the facility yesterday afternoon. It is truly magnificent. They have round-the-clock nursing staff, locked security perimeters, and beautiful enclosed gardens. We secured a premium private suite for you on the first floor. I looked down at the brochure, letting my lower lip tremble violently. A suite, I whispered, my voice cracking. But what about my house? What about Evelyns' garden? Who is going to water her rose bushes? That is the best part, Daddy. Brittany interrupted, her voice pitching higher with eager excitement. You do not have to worry about the house anymore. Trevor and I are going to handle the sale completely. We will pack up all your clothes and bring your favorite pictures to your new room. The moving company is already booked. They are coming to the house on Monday morning at 9 o'clock to start clearing things out. Trevor leaned back in his leather seat, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. We already executed the paperwork. George, he stated, delivering the fatal blow with cold, bureaucratic finality. The power of attorney. You signed for me allowed us to expedite your medical transfer and start the listing process. It is a done deal. You do not need to stress over the logistics. You will sleep in your own bed this weekend, and on Monday morning, we will drive you to your new home. Everything is legally finalized. They sat there staring at me, waiting for the inevitable emotional collapse. They expected tears. They expected a confused, pathetic plea for mercy. They had planned this public setting specifically because they thought the audience of wealthy diners would shame me into quiet compliance. They thought I would simply lower my head, accept my confinement, and surrender the keys to my entire life without a fight. I stared at the glossy brochure on the table. The background hum of the restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving only the sharp, clear rhythm of my own heartbeat. I looked at Trevor, who was taking a confident sip of his expensive scotch, anticipating a flawless victory. I looked at my daughter, who was watching me with the clinical detachment of a butcher observing a carcass. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. The frail, stooped posture I had maintained all evening evaporated. I straightened my spine, pressing my broad back firmly against the leather booth. The sudden physical transformation was so stark and so immediate that Brittany physically recoiled, pulling her hand away from mine as if she had been burned by a live wire. The waiter reappeared at our table holding a small leather notepad. Are we ready to order our entrees tonight? He asked, flashing a polite customer service smile, oblivious to the tension radiating from our booth. Trevor blinked, thrown completely off guard by the interruption and by my sudden change in demeanor. Give us another minute, he snapped, waving a dismissive, angry hand at the waiter. We are in the middle of a private family discussion. No, we are not, I said. My voice was no longer thin or raspy. It was a deep, resonant baritone that cut through the ambient noise of the dining room with absolute, unwavering authority. We are perfectly ready to order right now. I looked up at the waiter, offering him a calm, steady smile. I will have the 24-ounce dry-aged ribeye. I ordered my diction crisp and commanding. I want it cooked medium rare with a side of the truffle, mashed potatoes, and the grilled asparagus. And please bring me a bottle of your finest Cabernet Sauvignon. Not a glass. The entire bottle. The waiter nodded rapidly, scribbling down the order before turning on his heel and retreating quickly toward the kitchen. Trevor sat frozen in his seat. The smug satisfaction had been entirely wiped from his face, replaced by a profound, creeping confusion. He glanced at Brittany, who was staring at me with her mouth hanging slightly open. George, what exactly are you doing? Trevor demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, aggressive whisper. We are not celebrating. We just told you that you are moving into a memory care facility on Monday morning. I reached across the table and picked up the glossy Shady Pines brochure. I slowly, deliberately tore it directly in half. Then I stacked the halves and tore them again, dropping the shredded pieces onto the pristine white tablecloth. I am going to enjoy a very expensive steak, Trevor, I said, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact. I am going to drink a beautiful bottle of wine. And then I am going back to my house. I am not moving on Monday. I am not moving on Tuesday. I am not going anywhere. The torn pieces of the glossy brochure sat on the white tablecloth like snow. Trevor stared at the shredded paper, and his jaw tightened. The veins in his neck became rigid. He thought I was having a manic episode. He thought the stress of my deteriorating mind had finally caused a public break. He leaned forward and lowered his voice to a harsh whisper, telling me to stop making a scene. He told me people were looking at us and that I was only proving his point. Brittany nervously touched her pearl necklace, glancing around the dining room to see if anyone at the nearby tables was watching her humiliation. Trevor reached beside his feet and pulled the leather portfolio from his briefcase. He extracted the packet I had signed on Thursday and slid it across the table with a triumphant smile. "You signed the papers," he said. "You authorized me to handle the property." I turned the packet toward him and tapped the heading on the middle page. "Read it carefully, Trevor. It is a notice of restricted authority." I acknowledged receiving the document. "I did not grant you control over anything." His eyes dropped to the page. "The only person who claimed fiduciary authority was you," I continued. "Your signature is beneath a certification, stating that you reviewed the disputed equity obligation and attempted to act on my behalf. The banks and the county were already under fraud alert when you signed it." The confidence drained from his face. "You do not own my house. You cannot sell it, mortgage it, list it, or transfer it. What you carried away from my living room was not a power of attorney. It was a record of your own knowledge and intent." Trevor froze. The confidence drained from his eyes, replaced by a sudden flickering panic. He opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came out. I reached down to the seat beside me and picked up the thick manila folder I had prepared. It contained weeks of investigation, decades of betrayal, and the final desperate act of my late wife. I lifted it and dropped it squarely in the center of the table, right over the torn pieces of the nursing home brochure. The loud thud made Brittany jump in her seat. "What is this?" Brittany asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Stop playing these crazy games, Daddy. You are embarrassing yourself." "I am not playing games, Brittany," I replied, my voice echoing with a cold, heavy certainty. "I am ending them." "Open the folder." Trevor stared at the manila envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He hesitated. His corporate instincts were screaming at him that he had lost control of the negotiation. Finally, he reached out with a shaking hand and flipped the cardboard cover open. The first document sitting on top of the stack was the forensic financial audit Mr. Stanton had prepared. It was a detailed flowchart outlining the fraudulent home equity line of credit. It highlighted the fake post office box, the offshore shell accounts, and every single unauthorized wire transfer. "Look at the top page, Trevor." Back against the leather booth. "That is a comprehensive tracking map of the $450,000 you stole from the equity of my home. It shows the $50,000 you wired to the luxury car dealership. It details the $30,000 you wired to the travel agency for your little vacation to Cabo. It even includes the email correspondence between you and that disgraced notary who stamped the forged loan documents." Trevor looked down at the spreadsheet. All the color washed out of his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His eyes darted wildly across the numbers, recognizing his own hidden bank accounts, laid bare under the bright restaurant lights. His hand began to shake so violently that his expensive watch rattled against the wooden table. "You hacked my accounts," he whispered, staring blankly at the page. "You hired someone to hack my accounts." "I did not hack anything," I said calmly. "Every single document in that file was legally obtained." "Turn to the next page." Trevor seemed unable to move, so Brittany reached over with a trembling hand and flipped the spreadsheet over. Beneath it lay a transcribed conversation, printed on official law firm letterhead, accompanied by a sworn witness affidavit. The signature of Leo, the pawn shop owner, was stamped boldly at the bottom of the page. "Read that one carefully." "Brittany," I instructed, my tone completely devoid of any paternal warmth. That is a sworn legal statement from the owner of Leo's Gold and Pawn. Attached to it is a full transcript of the security camera footage from Tuesday afternoon." The footage where you slammed your dead mother's vintage medallion onto the glass counter and begged for quick cash. The footage where you bragged about stealing from your clueless father while he took a nap. The footage where you laughed about taking a luxury vacation because dealing with my fake mental decline was just so stressful for you. Brittany physically recoiled from the table. She pressed her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror. The deep bronze tan she had acquired on her stolen vacation seemed to turn ashen. She looked at me, shaking her head in a desperate, pathetic denial. "Daddy, I did not mean it," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I was just joking with the man. I was stressed. You do not understand." "I understand perfectly," I replied. I went to the pawn shop to buy back the only thing I had left of my wife. I was willing to pay any price to get it back, because it meant the world to me. But you treated it like scrap metal. You sold her memory for a plane ticket. But by selling that necklace, Brittany, you made the biggest mistake of your entire life. Turn to the final page. Brittany looked down at the folder. She did not want to touch it. She was terrified of what else was hiding in that stack of paper. Trevor was still staring into space, completely paralyzed by the realization that his entire financial life had just been exposed. With trembling fingers, Brittany lifted the pawn shop affidavit and revealed the final piece of evidence. It was a high-resolution color photocopy of a tiny square of paper. The paper was creased and worn. Written across the center in elegant looping cursive was a single hurried sentence. "George, check the equity. They think I do not know." Brittany's confident defensive posture completely shattered. The arrogant smile she had worn when she walked into the restaurant was gone entirely. Her eyes traced the familiar handwriting of her own mother. She recognized the narrow loop beneath the lowercase y and the delicate return stroke Evelyn had used for decades. She knew exactly what she was looking at. "You did not know that the gold medallion was actually a locket," I explained, my voice dropping into a harsh, relentless rhythm. Leo, the pawn shop owner, discovered the hidden spring mechanism while he was polishing it. He found a micro-memory card tucked inside the hollow cavity, along with that note. "Your mother discovered your massive fraud. She found the forged loan applications and the shell accounts. She gathered all the evidence and hid it inside the necklace she never took off. She was preparing to expose you both." Brittany began to cry. Thick, heavy tears spilled over her eyelashes and ran down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She stared at the photocopy of her mother's final desperate warning. The realization of what her greed had caused was crashing down on her all at once. "Your mother discovered that her only child was helping place our home in danger," I said, my anger finally breaking through. 3 days after writing that warning, she suffered the stroke that took her from me. I cannot prove what role that terrible stress played in her death, but I know she spent her final days carrying the weight of your betrayal alone. Then you stole the necklace she had used to preserve the evidence and sold it for a vacation. By doing that, you handed me the exact blueprints to your own destruction. Trevor's gaze finally snapped up from the photocopy of Evelyn's note. The heavy mahogany-paneled walls of the steakhouse seemed to close in around our booth. He stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine and had already heard the click of the detonator. His corporate arrogance, the slick, polished veneer he used to navigate boardrooms and manipulate my daughter, dissolved completely. He looked frantic. He looked exactly like what he was, a cornered criminal. He abruptly slammed his hands onto the white tablecloth and pushed himself up from the leather booth. The sudden violent motion knocked his half-empty glass of reserve scotch, overspilling the amber liquid across the pristine linen. "We're leaving," Trevor commanded, his voice tight and breathless, vibrating with raw panic. "Brittany, get your purse right now. We are leaving. This is over." Brittany remained frozen in her seat, her tear-streaked face still aimed down at her mother's final warning. She didn't move. She was paralyzed by the overwhelming, suffocating weight of what they had done. "I said we're leaving," Trevor hissed, reaching across the table and roughly grabbing her upper arm, trying to yank her out of the booth. Sit down, Trevor, I said. My voice was not loud. I did not raise it above the gentle clinking of silverware and the low murmur of conversation happening at the tables around us. But the tone I used was absolute. It was the voice of a man who held every single key to the doors of their future. It was the voice of a man who had already locked those doors from the outside. Trevor froze, his hand still gripping his wife's arm. He glared at me, his chest heaving as he tried to control his breathing. You don't control me, George. You don't own me. This conversation is finished. If you walk out of this Trevor, I said, meeting his frantic gaze with cold, dead certainty. The federal agents waiting for my signal will arrest you in the parking lot. Sit down. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving his deep vacation tan looking sickly and unnatural. He slowly let go of Brittany's arm and sank back down into the leather booth, moving as if the gravity in the room had suddenly tripled. He stared at me, his eyes wide, terrified, and completely defeated. Investigators. He whispered the words, barely making it past his lips. Mr. Stanton is a very thorough attorney, I explained, leaning slightly forward, my elbows resting on the edge of the table. He doesn't just draft wills, Trevor. He specializes in aggressive corporate litigation. And when I handed him your forged home equity line of credit documents yesterday afternoon, he recognized exactly what he was looking at. He didn't call the local police. Local police deal with stolen necklaces and petty theft. Mr. Stanton called his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. Trevor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing convulsively. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some slick, desperate lie, but I cut him off before he could form a single syllable. Do not insult my intelligence by trying to explain this away. I warned him, my voice dropping into a hard, unforgiving rhythm. We have the wire transfer logs. We know about the shell accounts you set up to hide the money. We know about the $50,000 you wired to the luxury car dealership. We know about the shady notary public whose license was revoked years ago, the man you paid off to stamp the forged signatures on the loan application. Mr. Stanton has already submitted the entire digital forensic audit to the federal authorities. The paperwork is filed. The investigation is active. You are already caught. Enough! I slammed my open palm against the table, the sharp crack of the impact silencing them both instantly. I looked at my daughter, feeling a deep, profound sorrow that I quickly shoved down beneath the cold stone of my resolve. She had always been entitled, always eager for the easy path, but watching her husband turn on her like a rabid dog was a brutal thing to witness. Yet she had made her choices. She had opened the door and let the wolf into our home. You both signed the paperwork on your lives, I said, my voice steady, relentless. And you sealed your fate when you booked that vacation. Trevor blinked, his brow furrowing in desperate confusion. The vacation, he muttered. What does Cabo have to do with this? I looked at him, feeling a grim, dark satisfaction spread through my chest. This was the final nail. The trap was about to spring completely shut, leaving them with absolutely no room to maneuver. You thought using the pawnshop cash for the airline tickets would make the vacation impossible to trace, I said. But the resort required an electronic payment to secure the suite. You used the debit card connected to the shell account, receiving the stolen equity funds. Trevor's eyes widened. That transaction matters because it links the fraudulent loan proceeds directly to your personal spending. The electronic transfers online account, access forged application, and interstate banking communications already form part of the federal fraud case. The Cabo reservation does not create the crime by itself. It proves that the money was never borrowed for a legitimate investment and that you knowingly used the proceeds for your own luxury. I watched the implications settle across his face. Stanton preserved the transaction record. Investigators can follow the money from the forged loan application to the shell account, and from the shell account directly to your resort. You are facing federal investigation, restitution, forfeiture, and the possibility of a substantial prison sentence. I watched the realization crush him. He wasn't just facing ruin. He was facing a decade in a federal penitentiary. The smug, polished corporate manager had vanished, replaced by a terrified, broken man who had just realized his life was entirely over. "You stole my wife's necklace," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, deadly whisper. "You plotted to lock me away in a psychiatric ward so you could steal my home. You broke my daughter's moral compass and turned her into a thief, and you killed the woman I loved with the stress of your monstrous greed." I sat back in the booth, the anger draining away, leaving only a cold, vast emptiness. "The trap is closed, Trevor. You are not moving me into a facility on Monday. You are going to be meeting with federal agents, and you are going to explain exactly how you stole $500,000 from a grieving widow. The game is over." Brittany was the first to break the heavy, suffocating silence that had fallen over our corner booth. Her hands trembled violently as she reached across the pristine white tablecloth, attempting to grab my arm. I slowly pulled my hands back, resting them in my lap, keeping a physical distance between myself and the daughter I no longer recognized. "Daddy, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic wail. "You have to believe me. I did not want to do any of this. It was all Trevor. He was the one who came up with the idea for the loan. He was the one who found that horrible notary. He told me it was just a smart financial maneuver, a way to leverage the equity, so we could make some investments and pay you back with interest. He said you would be proud of his business sense. He pressured me, Daddy. He told me if I did not give him the combination to your safe, he would leave me. I was just trying to save my marriage." I stared at her, letting the sheer magnitude of her cowardice wash over me. She was perfectly willing to steal my home and lock me in a psychiatric ward. But the moment the federal authorities were mentioned, she immediately transformed herself into a helpless, manipulated victim. Trevor let out a sound that was halfway between a bark and a choke. He stared at his wife with the look of absolute venomous disgust. The polished corporate executive had completely vanished, leaving behind a desperate, vicious animal backed into a corner. "Are you seriously trying to play the victim right now?" Trevor hissed, his voice shaking with a terrifying, uncontrolled rage. "You greedy, entitled, spoiled little brat. Do not you dare sit there and pretend you were forced into anything. You loved the money. You loved walking into the country club with a new designer handbag every single week. You loved the luxury cars and the expensive dinners. When I told you I was drowning in debt, you were the one who suggested we use your father's house. You were the one who said he was just sitting on a gold mine while we were struggling." "That is a lie!" Brittany screamed, slamming her hands onto the table and rattling the expensive silverware. "You are a liar. You promised me you had everything under control. You promised me nobody would ever find out. Find out!" Trevor mocked, leaning over the table and pointing a shaking finger directly in her face. You stole your dead mother's necklace and sold it to a pawn shop for a vacation. I did not make you do that, Brittany. That was all you. You practically bragged about it. You told me you deserved a break because pretending to care about a senile old man was too emotionally draining for you. You were measuring the square footage of this old man's house for a renovation while your mother was barely cold in the ground. "Stop it!" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing loudly across the dining room. Several people at the surrounding tables stopped eating and turned to stare at our booth. But neither of them cared anymore. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy life had been completely incinerated. They were burning their own marriage to the ground right in front of my eyes. I sat back against the leather seat and watched them tear each other apart. It was a brutal, ugly display of human selfishness, but I did not look away. For months, they had conspired in the shadows, whispering behind my back, planning my destruction, while smiling to my face. Now the shadows had been stripped away, and they were forced to look at the ugly, horrific reality of who they truly were. They had built an alliance on greed, and the moment that greed was threatened, the alliance shattered into a million jagged pieces. "You forged his signature." Brittany sobbed, pointing an accusing finger at her husband. You committed federal wire fraud. I am not going to jail for you. I will testify against you. I will tell the investigators everything they want to know. I will tell them about your secret accounts and your gambling debts. Trevor laughed, a dark, hollow sound that lacked any real humor. You think the federal government cares about your tears, Brittany, he sneered. You provided my access. You facilitated the theft. You enjoyed the proceeds of a criminal enterprise. You are an accessory to federal bank fraud. When the agents knock on our door tomorrow morning, they are putting handcuffs on both of us. The reality of his words finally penetrated her panic. Brittany stopped screaming. She looked at Trevor, her face completely drained of color, and then she slowly turned her gaze back to me. The anger and the blame vanished, replaced by a pathetic, crawling desperation. She realized that tearing Trevor down would not save her. I was the only person in the world who could stop the crushing weight of the justice system from obliterating her life. Daddy, she pleaded, her voice dropping to an agonizing whisper. Daddy, please. We are your family. I am your only child. You cannot let them send me to prison. I will do anything. We will sell the cars. We will empty our accounts. We will pay back every single penny we took from the equity line. Just please call Mr. Stanton. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. Tell him we had your permission to use the house. Tell the investigators it was all a terrible mistake. Trevor immediately latched onto her plea, turning his desperate eyes toward me. George, please listen to her, he begged, all his previous arrogance entirely erased. We made a monumental mistake, a massive error in judgment. But we can fix this. I know how to move money. I can liquidate my retirement portfolios. I can get another corporate job. I will pay back the bank. I will pay you back with interest. Just call your lawyer. Call him right now and tell him to withdraw the fraud brief. If you do this, George, I swear to you, we will take care of you for the rest of your life. We will be the perfect family. You will never have to worry about anything ever again. I sat in the leather booth, looking at the two people who had planned to lock me in a sterile, high-security ward and sell my life to the highest bidder. They were not begging for forgiveness, because they felt remorse for what they had done. They were not sorry that they had broken my heart. They were not sorry that their actions had killed Evelyn. They were only sorry that they had been caught. They were terrified of the consequences. The waiter suddenly appeared at the edge of our booth, carrying a large silver tray holding my dry, aged ribeye, the truffle mashed potatoes, and the grilled asparagus. He awkwardly cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the heavy, toxic atmosphere radiating from our table. He carefully placed the hot, steaming plate in front of me and quickly stepped away without saying a word. I looked down at the beautiful, expensive meal I had ordered. The smell of the roasted garlic and the seared meat was incredible. Then I looked back up at my daughter and her husband. "You want me to call my lawyer?" I asked, my voice quiet and perfectly steady. "You want me to lie to federal investigators to cover up your crimes? You want me to pretend that you did not steal my home, that you did not sell my wife's heirloom, that you did not sit in my living room yesterday and try to manipulate me into signing away my own freedom?" "Daddy, please," Brittany sobbed, fresh tears streaming down her face. "We love you. You do not know the meaning of the word." I replied, my tone completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "You do not love me, Brittany. You loved what I could provide for you. You loved the security of my money. And when you realized you could not access it fast enough, you decided to discard me like a broken piece of furniture. You sat across from me an hour ago and smiled while you told me the moving company was coming on Monday to clear out my house. You smiled while you told me I was going to be locked in a facility. I placed both of my hands flat on the white tablecloth. "I am not calling Mr. Stanton," I said, delivering the final absolute verdict. "I am not withdrawing the federal fraud brief. I am not paying off your debts. You built this prison with your own hands, and now you are going to live inside it." Trevor buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, broken groan of absolute despair. Brittany slumped forward, resting her forehead against the edge of the table, weeping uncontrollably. The destruction was complete. I reached into the inside pocket of my oversized tweed blazer. I pulled out my old worn leather wallet. I opened it and extracted 2 crisp $100 bills. I placed the cash squarely on the table right next to my untouched steak and the unopened bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon. "This will cover the cost of my meal and the wine," I said, my voice hard and resolute. "As for the rest of your tab, you will have to figure out how to pay for it yourselves. I strongly suggest you enjoy the rest of your evening. It is likely the last expensive dinner you will be having for a very long time." I did not wait for a response. I slid out of the leather booth and stood up, pulling my jacket tight across my shoulders. I did not look back at them. I did not offer a final goodbye. I simply turned and walked away. I navigated through the crowded dining room, moving past the tables of wealthy patrons enjoying their evening. I pushed open the heavy front doors of the steakhouse and stepped out into the cool, dark air of downtown Charlotte. The streetlights cast a warm, golden glow across the pavement. I took a deep, long breath, pulling the crisp night air into my lungs. The heavy, suffocating weight of the past few months had been entirely lifted from my shoulders. The trap had been sprung. The wolves had been caged. I walked down the sidewalk alone, but for the first time since my wife passed away, I felt completely, entirely at peace. The weekend passed in a heavy, profound silence. I spent Saturday and Sunday tending to Evelyns' garden, pulling weeds and pruning the rose bushes with meticulous care. I did not leave the property. I did not answer the phone. I just waited for the bureaucratic machinery of the federal government to grind into motion. Mr. Stanton had promised that the demolition would begin on Monday morning, and he was a man who absolutely delivered on his promises. I spent those quiet hours fortifying my position. I packed away the fragile, sentimental items Evelyn had cherished, ensuring nothing of value was left vulnerable. An architect knows that a fortress is only as strong as its perimeter, and I was building an impenetrable wall around my life. At exactly 6 in the morning on Monday, the quiet, affluent neighborhood where Brittany and Trevor leased their luxury townhouse was violently awakened. Stanton called me shortly after 8 to deliver the official tactical update. Federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with yellow letters across the back had descended on their property. They did not knock politely and wait for an invitation. They executed a federal search and seizure warrant with absolute, devastating precision. Stanton told me they confiscated everything of value. They took Trevor's encrypted laptop, his corporate mobile phone, and heavy cardboard boxes filled with physical financial records. They tore through Brittany's closets, cataloging every designer handbag and expensive pair of shoes she had purchased using the stolen funds from the fraudulent equity line of credit. The most humiliating blow came when the agents impounded the luxury imported vehicle sitting in their driveway. A heavy tow truck backed into the manicured cul-de-sac, hauling away the ultimate symbol of their fake wealth. Brittany and Trevor were forced to stand on their front lawn in their pajamas, shivering in the morning air, while their wealthy neighbors watched the entire spectacle unfold from behind parted curtains. They were not formally arrested that morning, but their passports were permanently confiscated. They were officially informed by the lead investigator that they were the primary targets of a massive federal bank fraud investigation. The walls of their carefully constructed illusion had completely collapsed, leaving them exposed to the harsh, brutal light of reality. The consequences of their overwhelming greed did not stop at their front door. Trevor had built his entire identity around his mid-level corporate management position. He loved the expensive tailored suits, the lavish corporate expense accounts, and the false sense of absolute authority. But the federal banking system is a tightly woven, inescapable net. The moment the fraud division flagged his personal accounts, an automatic alert was sent directly through his company's corporate compliance network. On Tuesday morning, Trevor attempted to walk into his gleaming glass office building downtown, pretending that everything was completely normal. He thought he could simply charm his way out of the crisis. He swiped his electronic security badge at the lobby turnstiles, but the heavy glass doors remained firmly locked. The scanning device blinked an angry bright red. Two large corporate security guards approached him immediately, stepping firmly into his path. Stanton informed me later that afternoon that Trevor was not even allowed to return to his private desk to collect his personal items. A human resources representative met him in the cold, sterile lobby. She handed him a standard cardboard box containing his framed photos and his desk calendar, and she informed him that his employment was terminated effective immediately, pending a severe federal criminal inquiry. I was escorted out of the building in front of his colleagues and his subordinates, completely stripped of his title, his stable income, and his arrogant pride. Without his impounded luxury vehicle to drive home, Trevor was forced to stand on the busy city sidewalk, holding a cardboard box, waiting for a public transit bus in his expensive charcoal suit. The smooth-talking executive had been reduced to an unemployed criminal suspect in a matter of hours, while Trevor's professional life was disintegrating into public ruin. Brittany was unraveling in her own pathetic, predictable way. The leased townhouse was a disaster zone after the federal search. Their bank accounts were completely frozen by government mandate. Their credit cards were systematically declined. She had no money, no social status, and a husband who was facing a decade in federal prison. In her mind, there was only one possible escape route left. She believed she could still play the role of the desperate, weeping daughter. She believed that if she just showed up at my front door, with tears streaming down her face, and begged for sanctuary, my paternal instincts would miraculously override my righteous anger. She thought she could manipulate her way back inside my house and hide safely from the total wreckage she had caused. It was Wednesday afternoon when I saw her coming. I was sitting at the kitchen island, drinking a cup of hot black coffee. My tablet computer was propped up on the marble counter, displaying a crisp, high-definition video feed from the newly installed security cameras surrounding the perimeter of the house. I watched a cheap yellow taxi pull up to the curb. Brittany stepped out, looking absolutely frantic and entirely broken. Her hair was a messy, tangled knot. She was wearing baggy gray sweatpants and carrying a large stuffed duffel bag over her shoulder. She did not look like the arrogant woman who had ordered an expensive glass of imported wine at the steakhouse just days ago. She looked like a desperate, terrified fugitive. She practically sprinted up the front walkway, her eyes darting nervously around the quiet suburban street, as if expecting federal agents to jump out from behind the bushes. She dropped her heavy duffel bag onto the porch and dug frantically through her messy purse. She pulled out the spare brass key I had given her years ago, the very key she had used just last week to barge into my home and plant a nursing home brochure on my counter. I watched the video feed intently, taking a slow, calm sip of my hot coffee. Brittany shoved the brass key into the deadbolt and tried to turn it. The lock did not budge a single millimeter. She pulled the key out, thinking she had inserted it upside down, and shoved it aggressively back into the cylinder. She twisted her wrist with desperate, frantic force, but the heavy metal mechanism refused to yield. I had called a professional locksmith on Sunday morning, paying double his usual hourly rate for an emergency weekend installation. Every single entry point on the property had been fortified with high-security commercial-grade deadbolts. Her old spare key was now completely worthless. It was nothing more than a jagged piece of useless scrap metal. On the high-resolution camera monitor, I watched Brittany jiggle the brass handle violently. She began to pound her fist against the heavy wooden door, her mouth opening wide as she shouted for me to let her inside. "Daddy," she yelled, her voice barely muffled by the thick glass and solid wood. "Daddy, please open the door. I know you are in there. Please, I have nowhere else to go. Trevor is going crazy. The government took everything. Please help me." She slammed her open palms against the doorframe, dropping to her knees on the welcome mat, in a display of pure, unadulterated panic. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly onto the concrete porch. Then she slowly stopped crying. She slowly lifted her head, her eyes tracing the line of the front porch ceiling. Right above the doorway, mounted securely into the red brickwork, was a sleek black security camera with a glowing red indicator light. It tracked her movement smoothly, adjusting its automated lens to focus directly on her tear-stained, ruined face. The realization washed over her with sudden, devastating clarity. I was not just ignoring her frantic knocks. I was actively watching her. I was sitting safely inside the impenetrable fortress I had built, completely protected from her toxic manipulation. I watched her stare up at the camera lens for a long, silent, agonizing moment. Her shoulders slumped forward as the final shred of hope evaporated entirely from her chest. She realized she was entirely locked out. She was locked out of the house. She was locked out of the blind trust fund. She was locked out of my life permanently. She gathered her heavy duffel bag and turned away, walking slowly back down the driveway toward the empty street. I reached out and tapped the screen of my tablet, closing the security video application. I finished my coffee, setting the empty ceramic mug down on the smooth marble counter. The massive legal and financial storm outside was raging violently for her, tearing her entire world apart. But inside my home, everything was finally perfectly quiet. I drove back into the heart of downtown Charlotte on a quiet Thursday morning. The turbulent emotional storms of the past few weeks had completely dissipated, leaving behind a crisp, clear sky and a profound sense of purpose. I navigated the familiar city streets with a relaxed grip on the steering wheel. I was heading back to the narrow storefront squeezed between the coffee shop and the old bookstore. I was going back to Leos Gold and Pawn. When I had first discovered the horrifying truth hidden inside my wife's vintage medallion, I knew my home would soon become a hostile battleground. I knew my daughter and her husband would be constantly looking for leverage or searching for valuables to steal while they plotted my forced institutionalization. I had not taken the physical necklace home with me that first day. I had taken the memory card and the handwritten note, but I had asked Leo to lock the heavy gold chain and the locket inside his master time delay vault. I told him I needed it kept absolutely secure until the criminals who stole it were completely neutralized by the federal authorities. Leo had agreed without a single hesitation, recognizing the absolute gravity of the situation. Now that the government had entirely dismantled their fraudulent lives, it was finally safe to bring Evelyns' memory back home. I parked my old sedan along the street and walked up to the shop. The bell above the heavy glass door chimed loudly as I pushed my way inside. The air still smelled of old brass and floor wax, just as it had on the darkest day of my life. Leo was standing behind the main display counter, arranging a row of vintage watches. He looked up, and a broad, genuine smile spread across his face when he recognized me. He set down the velvet display tray and walked over to the edge of the glass counter. "It is very good to see you, Mr. Keller," he said, his voice carrying a warm, respectful tone. "I saw the morning news reports about the massive bank fraud indictments in the suburbs. I assume the demolition went exactly according to your blueprints." I offered him a steady, grateful smile and nodded. "The federal agents executed their warrants on Monday morning," I told him. "They confiscated the stolen vehicles. They froze all the hidden shell accounts, and they terminated the corporate career that funded their arrogant illusions. The trap snapped shut perfectly, Leo, and they will not be climbing out of it for a very long time. I came back today to officially retrieve my property and to settle my debts with the man who helped me build that trap." Leo shook his head slowly, waving a calloused hand in the air. "You do not owe me anything else, sir," he insisted. "You already paid me the market value for the gold when you first came in. Holding it in my vault was just a simple professional courtesy. I am just glad that high-definition video footage from my back office was able to help you protect yourself from those parasites." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored navy blue suit and pulled out a thick, crisp envelope. I placed it squarely on the glass display case, sliding it across the smooth surface until it rested directly in front of his hands. "I did not just come to collect the necklace, Leo. I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute unwavering sincerity. That video footage did not just help my case. It was the undeniable, definitive evidence that completely destroyed my daughter's ability to play the innocent victim. It proved her criminal intent to the federal investigators beyond any shadow of a doubt. You handed me the exact weapon I needed to save my own life, and you did it simply because you knew it was the right thing to do. Leo looked down at the thick envelope. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of accepting a reward for an act of basic moral decency. He opened the flap and looked inside. His eyes widened slightly as he saw the thick stack of $100 bills. It was exactly double the original premium price we had discussed for the necklace. A massive financial reward for a man of genuine absolute integrity, Mr. Keller. "This is far too much money," he whispered, looking back up at me with a stunned expression. "I cannot possibly accept this much cash just for handing over a copy of a security tape." "You can and you will," I told him firmly, leaving absolutely no room for debate or refusal. A man who runs an honest business and protects grieving strangers from predators deserves to be rewarded. Take the money, Leo. Invest it in your shop. Take your family on a vacation. Just know that you have my eternal gratitude for the role you played in stopping a monster. Leo stared at me for a long, silent moment. He saw the resolute finality in my eyes and realized I would not take no for an answer. He slowly closed the envelope and nodded, tapping his hand gently against the glass counter. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "I will go back to the time delay vault right now and retrieve your wife's beautiful medallion." I stood alone in the quiet shop, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock on the wall. The sound was no longer ominous or terrifying. It was just a steady, peaceful rhythm marking the passage of time. A few minutes later, Leo emerged from behind the heavy velvet curtain, carrying the familiar burgundy velvet box. He placed it gently on the counter and opened the lid. The thick gold chain and the intricate circular locket rested perfectly against the cream-colored satin interior, polished and gleaming under the display lights. I reached out and picked up the medallion, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of the solid gold pressing into my palm. I ran my thumb over the smooth, polished surface, tracing the subtle grooves where the hidden spring mechanism lay perfectly concealed. I closed the velvet box, holding it tightly against my chest. I thanked Leo one final time, shook his honest, calloused hand, and walked out of the pawn shop, stepping back into the bright morning sunlight. The drive back to my suburban neighborhood was incredibly peaceful. The radio played soft, classic jazz and the roads were clear. I pulled into my driveway and looked at the sturdy brick colonial house. It was no longer a crime scene. It was no longer a vulnerable target for greedy predators. It was my sanctuary again, fully fortified and completely secure. I walked through the front door and moved straight down the quiet hallway toward my study. I closed the heavy wooden door behind me and walked over to the corner of the room. I knelt in front of the heavy steel safe, spinning the brass dial with practiced, familiar precision. The heavy internal locking mechanisms clicked smoothly into place, and the thick metal door swung open, revealing the sturdy internal shelves. I placed the burgundy velvet box back onto the middle shelf, exactly where it belonged. I rested my hand on the soft fabric, staring into the dark, secure cavity of the safe. A profound, overwhelming sense of closure washed over my entire body. I thought about the tiny handwritten note that had been folded inside that locket. I thought about Evelyns sitting alone at my desk late at night, piecing together the massive, fraudulent crimes our daughter was committing. Evelyn had always been the fiercely protective heart of our family, even as her own health failed under the crushing weight of that terrible betrayal. Her only thought was of my survival. She knew she was running out of time. She knew they thought I was clueless and vulnerable. She used her most treasured possession, her signature piece of jewelry, to forge an impenetrable shield for me to find. She guided my hand from beyond the grave, giving me the exact blueprints I needed to dismantle their conspiracy and survive the collapse of our family. I gently closed the heavy steel door of the safe, spinning the brass dial to scramble the combination and lock it securely. I stood up and let out a long, slow breath, feeling the last lingering trace of grief finally release its grip on my lungs. The house was perfectly silent, but it was no longer an empty silence. It was a comfortable, warm quiet. My daughter had stolen a necklace to buy a vacation, but she had unknowingly delivered her mother's final act of love. Evelyn had protected me one last time, and because of her brilliant, meticulous sacrifice, I was finally completely safe. The federal justice system moves with a deliberate, crushing inevitability. The initial shock of the morning raid on the townhouse was quickly replaced by the grueling reality of a massive multi-agency criminal investigation. Mr. Stanton kept me thoroughly informed, monitoring the court dockets with the precision of a seasoned general tracking enemy troop movements. The tactical advantage we had built was absolute. There were no hidden escape routes left for my daughter or her husband. Trevor was a man whose entire existence was predicated on preserving his own status and comfort. He had spent his career managing risks, shifting blame, and sacrificing subordinates to protect his own corporate trajectory. When the federal prosecutors placed the mountain of evidence on the polished mahogany table of the interrogation room, the memory card, the sworn pawnshop, affidavit, the corrupted power of attorney, and the detailed forensic financial audit, Trevor did exactly what a cornered predator always does. He turned on the weakest member of his pack to save his own skin. Stanton called me late on a Tuesday afternoon to deliver the news. Trevor had officially accepted a comprehensive plea agreement. In exchange for a significantly reduced prison sentence, he agreed to fully cooperate with the federal investigators. He provided them with the passwords to the offshore shell accounts. He detailed the exact methodology used to forge Evelyns' signature on the loan documents. And most devastatingly, he testified under oath that Brittany was a willing, active, and enthusiastic participant in the entire criminal enterprise. He stated on the federal record that she had voluntarily supplied my social security number, that she had memorized the combination to my private safe, and that she had personally planned the theft of her mother's vintage gold medallion to fund their luxury vacation. He completely threw his own wife under the heavy treads of the federal justice machine to shave 5 years off his own incarceration. The alliance that had been built on shared greed and mutual arrogance shattered completely under the intense pressure of the prosecution. Brittany, who had spent her entire adult life feeling entitled to other people's money, suddenly found herself facing the full, unshielded consequences of federal bank fraud, without a husband to hide behind, and without a father to bail her out. The financial devastation hit her before the criminal charges were even fully processed. With Trevor's corporate income completely gone and their bank accounts frozen by the government, the reality of their massive debt collapsed on her like a concrete wall. The luxury cars were gone. The expensive leased townhouse was repossessed. The designer clothes and the high-end jewelry were either confiscated as evidence or sold off for pennies to pay for the initial retainer of a bargain basement defense attorney. She was left with nothing but crushing legal fees and a severely damaged public reputation. The socialite, who had sneered at my modest lifestyle and mocked my supposed cognitive decline, was now completely destitute. To survive, she had to do something she had actively avoided for a decade. She had to get a job. Not a prestigious corporate position or an elegant consulting gig, but a grueling entry-level minimum wage retail job at a massive discount department store on the far outskirts of Charlotte. I received the updates from the private investigator Stanton had kept on retainer. He sent me a brief report detailing her new reality. The woman who had laughed about stealing her dead mother's heirloom to buy expensive margaritas in Cabo was now spending 8 hours a day folding cheap t-shirts and sweeping dressing rooms under the harsh, buzzing glare of fluorescent lights. She took the public bus to work because she could no longer afford a vehicle. She lived in a cramped, noisy studio apartment above a busy commercial intersection. She was experiencing exactly what it meant to live without the invisible financial safety net she had taken for granted her entire life. I felt a profound, hollow sadness reading that report, but I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The path to that discount department store was paved entirely with her own arrogant, cruel decisions. I had spent 45 years trying to shield her from the harsh realities of the world, and that protection had only bred a monstrous, consuming entitlement. Now the world was teaching her the brutal, uncompromising lessons I should have taught her decades ago. It was a rainy Thursday evening when my cell phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I was sitting at the Marble Island, reviewing some new architectural blueprints for a small community project I had decided to consult on. I looked at the illuminated screen. The caller identification displayed a local Charlotte number that I did not recognize, but the rhythmic vibrating pattern felt immediately familiar. I did not answer. I let it ring. I watched the screen glow in the dim light of the kitchen until the call finally went to voicemail. 5 minutes later, I opened my voicemail application. I tapped the small play icon and lifted the phone to my ear. Daddy, the voice on the recording, was fragile, shaky, and completely stripped of its former arrogance. It was the voice of a broken, desperate woman who had finally run out of options. Daddy, please. It is Brittany. I know you are angry. I know what Trevor and I did was unforgivable. I am so incredibly sorry. I am so sorry for everything. She paused, taking a ragged, shuddering breath. The background noise on the recording sounded like traffic, confirming she was calling from a noisy street, or perhaps a bus stop. Trevor took a plea deal. Daddy, she sobbed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic wail. He blamed everything on me. The lawyers are saying I might go to prison. I have no money left. I cannot make rent this month. The job at the store barely covers my groceries. Please, Daddy. I am begging you. I just need a small loan. Just enough to pay my attorney and keep my apartment. I will pay you back, I swear. I will do whatever you want. Please just call me back. I am so scared. Please. The recording ended with a sharp metallic click. The silence in the kitchen rushed back in heavy and absolute. I sat perfectly still, holding the phone in my hand. I listened to the rain beating against the windows of the home she had actively plotted to steal. I thought about the glossy brochure for the locked memory care facility she had left on my counter. I thought about the cruel laughter on the pawn shop security tape. I thought about the forged signatures and the fake concern. I thought about Evelyns sitting alone in the dark, trying to protect our family with her dying breath. There was a time when that desperate weeping voice would have shattered my heart. There was a time when I would have moved heaven and earth to protect my daughter from pain, regardless of what it cost me. But that time had passed entirely. The man who would have rescued her had died the moment I read the hidden note inside that gold medallion. The father she was begging for help no longer existed. I looked at the phone screen. I tapped the small trash can icon. The voicemail vanished instantly, deleted permanently from the digital archive. I opened the contact settings menu, typed in the unfamiliar local number, and selected the option to block the caller. The prompt asked me to confirm my decision to prevent any future communication from this contact. I tapped the screen one final time, confirming the block with absolute, unwavering certainty. I set the phone face down on the cold marble counter. I picked up my pen and turned my attention back to the architectural blueprints spread out in front of me. The lines were clean, the angles were sharp, and the foundation was solid. The past was permanently sealed, and the future was finally entirely my own to build. The evening air in North Carolina carried a familiar, gentle warmth that settled over the neighborhood like a comforting blanket. I stood in the center of my kitchen, listening to the low, steady hum of the coffee maker. The house was wrapped in an absolute, profound silence, but it was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a grieving widower. It was the peaceful quiet of a fortress that had withstood a massive, brutal siege and remained entirely standing. I reached into the cupboard and pulled out a heavy ceramic mug, the one Evelyn used to drink from on Sunday mornings. I poured the dark, steaming coffee, letting the rich, earthy aroma fill the space around me. I walked slowly through the house, moving from room to room with a deep, unhurried grace. I ran my hand along the smooth, polished wood of the hallway console table. I looked at the front door, where the heavy commercial-grade deadbolts I had installed gleamed softly in the fading light. The security cameras mounted outside were silently standing guard, sending their crisp, high-definition signals to the secure server hidden in my study. The physical perimeter was flawless. The legal perimeter was even stronger. Mr. Stanton had finalized the impenetrable blind trust, permanently locking away every single penny of my liquid wealth behind a wall of complex, impenetrable corporate law. The fraudulent equity line of credit had been officially dissolved by the Federal Banking Commission, wiping away the massive debt my daughter and her husband had attempted to anchor to my property. The threat was entirely, completely neutralized. I was the sole, undisputed master of my own life. I pushed open the glass patio door and stepped out onto the back porch. The wooden planks groaned softly under my weight, a familiar, comforting sound I had known for 30 years. I sat down in my favorite wooden rocking chair, resting the warm ceramic mug on my knee. The backyard was bathed in the spectacular golden light of a late autumn sunset. The shadows of the tall oak trees stretched long and dark across the perfectly manicured grass. Evelyns' rose bushes were in full vibrant bloom, their heavy red petals swaying gently in the evening breeze. I had spent the entire morning tending to them, whilst pulling the invasive weeds from the soil and ensuring the roots were protected for the coming winter. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I watched the sky transition from a bright, brilliant orange into deep shades of purple and indigo. As I sat there, swaying gently in the rocking chair, I allowed myself to reflect on the monumental, terrifying journey of the past 2 months. As an architect, I had spent my entire professional career studying the vital importance of structural integrity. I knew that the true strength of a building is never revealed on a sunny, pleasant day. The true strength of a building is only revealed when the absolute worst storm hits, when the wind howls and the ground shakes. My life had been hit by a catastrophic, unnatural storm. The people I had trusted most in the world had attempted to tear down my walls from the inside. They had tried to exploit my grief, manipulate my reality, and strip me of the very shelter I had built to protect my family. They operated on the deeply flawed assumption that blood guaranteed submission. They believed that simply because I was a father, I would blindly accept any abuse, any theft, any humiliation they chose to inflict upon me. They were wrong. I had learned the harshest, most brutal lesson a parent can ever learn. Blood does not guarantee loyalty. Blood is nothing more than a biological coincidence. It does not automatically generate respect, and it certainly does not excuse predatory criminal behavior. Loyalty is a choice demonstrated through consistent, honest actions. Respect is earned through integrity. My daughter and her husband had abandoned those virtues entirely, choosing instead to worship at the altar of their own selfish, consuming greed. They had looked at my life and seen nothing but a balance sheet waiting to be liquidated. I felt a deep, lingering sorrow for the daughter I thought I had raised, but I felt absolutely no regret for the actions I had taken to stop her. The amputation of a toxic, infected limb is a painful, excruciating process, but it is the only way to save the rest of the body from dying. I had severed the infection completely. I had excised the rot from my life using the cold, uncompromising blade of truth. The illusion of a perfect family had been shattered, but what remained in its place was something far more valuable. It was the truth. And the truth, coupled with meticulous, careful preparation, had guaranteed my permanent peace. I reached my free hand into the breast pocket of my woven sweater. My fingers brushed against a small, familiar square box covered in soft velvet. I pulled it out and rested it on the palm of my hand. I slowly opened the lid, revealing the heavy vintage gold medallion resting on its bed of cream-colored satin. The last rays of the setting sun caught the polished surface of the gold, making it shine with a warm, brilliant light. This piece of metal had been the catalyst for the entire collapse. It was the shiny object that had tempted my daughter into revealing her true nature. She had stolen it for a few moments of luxury on a beach, completely unaware that she was setting her own life on fire. She had looked at this beautiful heirloom and seen only scrap weight. She had never understood its true value because she had never understood the woman who wore it. I lifted the heavy gold chain from the box and let the medallion dangle from my fingers. I gently pressed my thumb against the hidden spring mechanism located along the outer groove. The front face of the locket popped open with a soft, satisfying click. The hollow cavity inside was entirely empty now. The tiny micro-memory card and the folded handwritten note were safely locked away in a federal evidence vault, serving as the undeniable foundation of the criminal prosecution against the people who had tried to destroy me. But the absence of the physical note did not matter. I knew the words by heart. I would carry that final desperate warning with me for the rest of my days. Evelyn had always been the meticulous, observant protector of our home. Even as her body failed her, she had refused to surrender to the darkness without leaving me a map to the surface. She had gathered the evidence, compiled the financial records, and hidden the truth where she knew they would eventually lead me to find it. She had shielded me from the absolute worst kind of betrayal, fighting a silent, solitary war so that I could survive the aftermath. The sky above the tree line darkened into a deep navy blue, and the first faint stars began to appear through the fading light. The air grew cooler, carrying the crisp, clean scent of pine needles and damp earth. The neighborhood was perfectly still. There were no more frantic phone calls to answer. There were no more manipulative lies to navigate. There was only this quiet, beautiful evening, and the absolute certainty that I was finally completely safe. I closed the golden locket, feeling the mechanism snap securely back into place. I wrapped my fingers tightly around the heavy, warm metal, pressing it gently against my chest, right over my heart. I closed my eyes and let a deep, profound sense of gratitude wash over my entire being. I thought about Evelyn, about the 40 wonderful years we had shared, and about the incredible, brilliant sacrifice she had made to ensure I could sit on this porch and watch the sunset in peace. I looked up at the darkening sky, feeling a gentle breeze rustle through the leaves of the old oak trees. The war was officially over. The foundation of my life had held strong against the storm. I smiled a soft, genuine smile into the quiet twilight. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice carrying clearly into the peaceful evening air. "Thank you, my love."